Hey, I'm Matt from MWA Woodworks, and this video is a compilation of everything I know about making cabinets. I've gone back and taken all the best parts out of my cabinet videos over the last 5 years and put them in one master collection so that you have one source for everything. I'm going to walk you through how to build kitchen cabinets, both upper and lower, pantry storage, a complete kitchen island build, a sideboard, as well as some shop storage. And along the way, I'm going to show you how to properly size your cabinets, build and install drawers, build frame and panel doors, face frames, and install side mount and under mount drawer slides. There will be plans available as well, and also a chapter list so that you can find what you need to inside of the video. All right, that's enough talking. Let's get to it. In this video, I'm going to show you how to build standard cabinets like this that can go in your kitchen, your pantry, or in my case, my shop. I'll show you how I build the carcass as well as the face frame and the doors and drawers. Now there is a ton of information to cover, so let's get started. To begin building these cabinet carcasses, I need some 3/4 inch plywood and some 1/4 inch plywood for the backs and later the drawer bottoms. And the first thing that I need to do is break this plywood down into manageable chunks. Now, one of my favorite ways to break down plywood is to use one of these centipede work holders with a piece of foam laying on top. It's a quick and easy way to set up a horizontal work surface that allows me to cut all this plywood at a comfortable height and not be doing it down kneeling on the floor. To break this down, I'm going to be using my track saw. Now, if you don't have a track saw, that's just fine. You can use a circular saw here instead. You just need to make sure that you have some kind of straight edge to act as a guide for your saw. And once I have all of my plywood blanks cut, I can take them over to the table saw to cut them to final dimensions. You can see here that I'm not removing much material, just really ripping off those ragged factory edges so that I get nice clean edges on all my parts. Next, I'll cut out a bunch of strips that are going to be used for the stretchers and the toe kicks. And the stretchers here are all the same size at 4 inches wide, and the toe kicks are 4.5 inches wide. The next step is to cut a notch out of the bottom corners, and this is going to be where the toe kicks go. My favorite way to do this is using a bandsaw. I just set my fence to my mark and I cut until I reach the depth that I want. And to mark that depth, I'm using a mag switch as a positive stop. This is a great way to make sure that all of your cuts are repeated exactly the same so that your parts all end up alike. Now, another way to cut these out if you don't have a bandsaw is to use a jigsaw with a square as a guide. You can see here that I just clamp everything down to my workbench and carefully run the jigsaw along the square. And if you use a fine-tooth blade on your jigsaw, it really produces a nice clean cut on this plywood. After the notches are cut, I need to work on cutting grooves in the sides of the carcass, and this is going to house the bottom and the back of the cabinet. And I'm just going to go ahead and draw a couple of quick reference lines here. This is just to make sure that I cut these grooves on the right side of each of the carcass sides so that they mirror one another when I assemble the cabinet. Now, one way to cut these is using a router bit. I have a special router bit that is sized exactly for 3/4 inch plywood, which is going to give me a nice snug fit. Now, since the bottom of the cabinet is going to sit just above the toe kick, I'm going to use the toe kick itself to set the distance from the fence. This will ensure a perfect fit with no gaps at the bottom of the cabinet, and I don't have to measure anything. Each cabinet side is going to get one of these grooves. Now, once those are cut, I need to do the same thing, but this time making a 1/4 inch groove along the back of each side. This groove is going to sit just in front of the stretcher, so again, I'm going to use the stretcher to set the distance. And this is another special router bit that is sized specifically for 1/4 inch plywood. And keeping with our theme of alternate ways to do things, if you don't have a router or a router table, you can also cut these using a table saw. You can use a set of dado blades, or you can do what I'm doing here and just use a single saw blade to make these cuts and take multiple passes. And once I make the first cut, I just move the fence a tiny little bit and make another pass, sneaking up on the cut until the plywood fits perfectly into the dado. Okay, one thing you should do now if you want adjustable shelves in your cabinet is to add the shelf pinholes. Doing it right now is way easier than once you already have the cabinet built. Now with that, the sides are done and it's time to build the carcasses. I'm going to be using pocket screws as the primary joinery, and so to do that, I need to go ahead and add pocket holes to all the stretchers. In my opinion, cabinet construction is the perfect application for pocket holes. They are plenty strong enough even without glue, and they make building cabinets quick and easy. To get started assembling the cabinet, I need to add some glue to that bottom dado. Now, this is the only place that I'm going to be using glue because I won't be using screws here. I slide the bottom paddle into the dado and do the same thing on the other side before adding clamps. Next, I'm going to go ahead and spin the cabinet around so that I can add the back stretchers. Now, once the stretchers are in place, I go ahead and clamp the heck out of them to make sure that they don't go anywhere, and I screw them into place. I then flip the cabinet onto its top and add 2 more stretchers. Now, you'll notice that on that back stretcher, I'm using a scrap of 1/4-inch ply as a spacer, which is going to represent the back panel of the cabinet. I'll show you what this looks like and why this matters in just a minute. Alright, here we go, another flip. This time we're going to flip it onto its front so that I can add the drawer divider. Now, to add the drawer divider, I'm using 2 scraps of plywood that are the exact same size to act as spacers. I can then just clamp the drawer divider to the top stretcher like this before screwing it into place. Now, here's where you can see the slot that I created for the back panel to slide into, and this is the reason why I used that 1/4-inch plywood as a spacer. Okay, with all the stretchers installed, I can add the toe kick. And this also attaches with pocket screws. And this cabinet carcass is almost done. The last thing I need to do here is to cut some 1/4-inch ply to use for the back of the cabinet. And that just slides right into that pocket at the top and gets nailed into the back stretcher with the brad nailer. And just like that, we got ourselves a carcass. Now, for this cabinet, I built it with a spot on the top for a single drawer and a door on the bottom. Now, for my shop cabinets, I want a lot of drawer space. So I'm going to show you how to modify this cabinet to make a 4-drawer version. The cabinet is built the exact same way. The only difference is the number of drawer dividers that you add. After installing the first drawer divider, I just use the spacers again and add a second divider and then a third using the exact same method. Spacing of the dividers is going to depend on how big you want your drawers to be. I'm making mine with 3 of the drawers being the exact same size with a bigger drawer at the bottom. Now, if you want to join 2 or more cabinets together into one unit, the way to do that is to just clamp them together so that the edges are all flush and screw them from the inside of the cabinet. In this case, I put the screws in the 4-drawer side so that they're never going to be seen. One benefit to combining cabinets like this is that you can make one face frame to cover them both, and that's what I'm going to work on next. For my face frames, I'm going to use hard maple to match the maple plywood that I'm using. If you're going to be painting your cabinets, you could also use poplar as a slightly cheaper option here. After I cut my lumber into rough blanks, I go ahead and joint one edge to make sure that it's nice and straight. And then I just need to rip all these down to final width. My face frame will be mostly 1 1/4-inch parts to give me a 1/4-inch overhang on both sides of the plywood, and the part where the 2 cabinets meet in the middle will be 2 inches. I can then cut everything to length using a crosscut sled. Now again, a miter saw can be used here if you don't have a sled for your table saw. To join my face frame parts together, I'm going to use pocket screws again. This is another thing that pocket screws are really good for because they're never going to be seen. One tip I have for you if you're screwing into really hard woods like this maple is to wax your screws to keep them from stripping or snapping off the heads. Another tip is to make sure that you clamp down each joint to keep the parts from shifting. With pocket screws, if you don't clamp that joint down tightly, it will move on you. And tip number 3 is to use a spacer to help you line up your face frame parts evenly. Here I'm using that spacer to make sure that I get a proper distance between all my drawer dividers. And that's pretty much it for making a face frame. I give each of my face frames a good once over with 120 grit sandpaper and then 180 grit sandpaper, and this is going to get rid of any of the mill marks on the maple, and it's also going to make sure that those joints are all nice and flush. To attach the face frames to the cabinets, I'm going to use glue and clamps. Now, if I were going to paint the cabinets, I would go ahead and use a brad nailer to fix the face frame. I could fill the holes in before I painted it and you wouldn't see them. But since this is going to be raw maple, I'm just going to go ahead and clamp them and wait for the glue to dry so that I don't have any visible nail holes on the face. Now, when it comes to drawers, you have a couple of different choices of material. You could use hardwoods like poplar, maple, or oak, which I would do if this was a project for my kitchen or a bathroom. But for all other cases, I like using 5/8 inch Baltic birch plywood. I think it looks really nice all sanded up and finished, and it works well for office projects, pantries, and other built-in projects, or in my case, shop cabinets. After cutting up all the parts that are going to make the four sides of each drawer, I need to cut a 1/4 inch dado along one side. This can be done using the table saw the same way that I cut the dados in the side of the carcass to hold the back panel. Again, I just slowly sneak up on the cut until the drawer bottom material fits snugly like this. Okay, now I actually messed up by putting dados in the drawer backs. Well, I didn't really mess up so much as I just decided that I wanted to show you a different way to build the drawers. I think this way is better. So instead of having that dado on the back, I want to go ahead and cut those drawer backs just above that dado. This is going to allow me to slide the drawer bottom in from the back once the drawer is already assembled. You'll see what I mean in a minute. To assemble the drawer, lay out your parts with the grooves facing out. Your front and back parts will have the pocket holes in them and the sides won't. Arrange the parts so that the front and back sit inside the sides and clamp them together, making sure that the dados line up all the way around the drawer. Then just go ahead and screw everything securely together. Now you can just slide that drawer bottom into the grooves from the back side nice and easy. Sometimes a little tap here helps. Then you could just use screws or brad nails to fasten the bottom into place. Easy peasy lemon squeezy. Now for these cabinets, I'm going to install full extension side mount slides. To attach the slides to the drawer, go ahead and set that drawer on a flat reference surface and set the slide on the same surface, lining up the front of the slide with the front of the cabinet like this. This is the easiest way I've found to consistently install these drawer slides on both sides perfectly. Then I go ahead and remove the part of the slide that goes inside the cabinet by pressing the little tab that releases the locking mechanism, and they slide right off. Now to install these slides into the cabinet, I get myself a piece of scrap plywood that is cut to the exact height of my first set of drawer slides on the top side of the cabinet. I then just rest my slide right on top of that scrap and screw it into place. I can move the scrap over to the other side and repeat that same process. You'll also see that I'm using a 1/4 inch strip of plywood to act as a spacer so the slides won't be blocked by the face frame. And after repeating that process on all my cabinets, I take my scrap plywood and I cut it down to match the height of the next set of slides. I then install those the same way, and then I measure for my next set and repeat that process all the way down the cabinet. I can then pop my drawers into place, and now we have something that really looks like a cabinet. All I need to do now is dress up the front. To begin making the frame and panel fronts, I need to cut all my frame parts, and again, I'm going with hard maple. All of these parts are going to be 2 inches wide because that's what I think looks the best, but this is really up to you what size you choose. Now after cutting all the frame parts to length, I go ahead and add a 1/4 inch groove down one side of each piece. This is where the center panel is going to go. I then need to cut a tongue or a tenon on the ends of the top and bottom frame pieces. These will be used to connect the frame together. Now to do this operation, I'm using a special jig called a tenoning jig. My tenoning jig attaches to the auxiliary fence of my table saw. Basically, what a tenoning jig does is it allows you to make these very precarious vertical cuts safely and accurately on your table saw. I'm also using a dado stack here to make these cuts, mainly for speed. You can do this with a single saw blade, but you'll need to make multiple passes, which is just going to take a bit longer. And this is what that tenon will look like. Isn't that awesome? And I made it all on the table saw. Now for the center panels, I like to use 1/2-inch plywood, and I'm going to go ahead and cut a rabbet around all 4 sides. Doing this will allow the side of the panels to go into the grooves of the frame. Alright, to begin building the door, I go ahead and add glue to the tongues and insert them into the grooves on the frame sides. I can then just slide one of those panels into place like this. Then I can add the final frame side with more glue and tap everything into place before clamping it together. I also like to go ahead and get rid of any of that squeeze out around the joints. Just makes sanding a little bit easier later. Now to build the drawer fronts, I do the exact same process, just on a smaller scale. Now the benefit to using 1/2-inch plywood here is that the center panel will be flush with the back side of the frame. This will help by giving you a completely flat back to mount them to the drawers. Now once everything is out of the clamps, just like the face frame, I'm going to sand these to 180 grit to make sure all those joints are nice and flush. Alright, the last detail we need to attend to is the drawer pulls and the hinges. I need to drill the holes for the drawer pulls, and I'm going to use this really cool jig to do it. Now there are a lot of jigs like this out on the market, but this one is from True Position. It has adjustable stops that allow you to line up the drill guide to the top and side of the drawer to perfectly position your pull. And you can adjust the 2 drill guides to match up perfectly with whatever size pull you're using. This jig makes adding pulls to multiple drawers fast and repeatable. And for the door, I'm going to go ahead and install hidden cup hinges. Now sometimes you may hear someone say Euro hinges, that's the exact same thing. And to drill the pockets for the hinges, I'm going to use another fancy jig. The drill bit here has a depth stop that cuts the perfect size pockets. You can see the hinge just drops right in that hole, and I can go ahead and pre-drill those screw holes using a self-centering drill bit. This is just going to put that pilot hole right in the center so that when you screw the hinge in, it doesn't wander off square. Now, you might notice that my bottom hinge here is located a little further from the edge than the top one is, and that's just to allow for something special that I have planned for this cabinet, which is going to be revealed in a future video. And the same jig that I use for the drawer pulls will also work for the door pull too. Now to install the door, I have a nifty little trick where I make a makeshift spacer out of a couple of scraps of plywood that I attach to the bottom of the face frame using double-sided tape. I then set the door on that spacer, and now I know that my door is exactly positioned right where I want it, and I can go ahead and drill the pilot holes and screw the door into place. Now to install the drawer front on top of it, I have a dead simple process that makes installing drawer fronts much less of a headache. To begin, I go ahead and add a spacer strip 1/8 of an inch thick on top of the door to create the reveal that I want. I then make sure it's lined up with the door on both sides. Now my trick for installing these drawer fronts is to go ahead and screw in from the front of the drawer using the 2 holes I drilled for the drawer pull. Now this gets the drawer firmly attached so that I can go ahead and open the drawer and screw it into place from the back side. I can then remove the screws from the front and use a drill bit to drill all the way through the drawer. I then just go ahead and add the pull and fasten it into place. I did the exact same process on the 4-drawer cabinet, just adding a spacer between each drawer as I work my way up the cabinet, and bam, done. Whew, man, that was a ton of information. I think I covered it all, but if you do have any other questions, please leave those below in the comments. I'd love to help out. In this video, I'm going to show you 2 different ways to build wall cabinets. The first way with more basic construction that's good and sturdy for use in your shop, and the other way more traditional like what you would see in a kitchen or pantry. I'll go over how to build the carcass as well as the face frame and show you how to build frame and panel doors using a table saw. Now there is a lot of information to cover, so let's get going. Alright, to do the 2 different versions of these cabinets, I need some 3/4 inch plywood for the carcasses, some 1/2 inch plywood for the door panels and backs, and some 1/4 inch plywood for the backs of the traditional style cabinets. The first thing I need to do is break this plywood down into manageable chunks. And if you've watched my previous videos, you know I love doing this with one of these centipede work holders with a piece of foam insulation on top. It's quick to set up and lets me cut at a comfortable height and not on the floor. To break this down, you'll need a circular saw and a straight edge at a minimum, but I like to use my track saw because it creates a lot less dust in the shop, which is important to me. After I have all my blanks cut, I can move to the table saw to cut all my parts to final size. And the first thing I like to do here is to cut off the ragged factory edges, which is just going to make everything clean and crisp on all sides. Now, compared to base cabinets, the wall cabinet parts are pretty straightforward and much smaller. I'm going to be making two 30-inch cabinets and two 18-inch cabinets, and then I'm going to combine each 30-inch cabinet to an 18-inch cabinet to make two 48-inch units. And I'll show you how that happens later in the video. And just like that, I have all the parts cut to make my cabinets. Okay, first up, I'm going to show you the more basic form of construction, which uses pocket screws. But you'll notice I'm not using my normal pocket hole jig. So this is a Castle pocket cutting machine, and it's really changing the way that I make pocket holes. This machine uses a set of routers to cut the pocket as well as the pilot hole for the screw, all in one easy motion. You can see here when I push back on the lever, one router bit swings up, cutting the pocket, and when I pull the lever forward, another bit drills the pilot hole. The result is a very clean pocket with no debris left inside. And the ease of use makes this machine very quick at cutting lots of pockets in my cabinet parts. Next, I need to cut a rabbet along the back edge of each side, which is going to end up housing the back panel of the cabinet. To do this, I'm just using a regular table saw blade and taking multiple passes until I can fit my back panel in place nice and flush. Another thing I'm going to do here is to mark which edge is the bottom of the cabinet, and this is just going to allow me to keep everything oriented correctly so that when I put it together, all my sides are facing the correct way. Now with this simple spacer block that I made out of plywood, I'm going to go ahead and use my shelf pin jig to drill out all my shelf pin holes. I very much recommend doing this step now before assembly because it's much easier to drill accurate hole locations. As I mentioned, assembling this version of the cabinet is going to be pretty basic. I'm lining up the bottom panel flush with the sides and clamping it into place before I drive my pocket screws home. I then repeat that same process with the top panel, just making sure that I assemble the cabinet face down so that the rabbets that I cut in the sides are exposed. I quickly double check everything for square before I add glue to the rabbets and slide the 1/2-inch back panel in place. I'm going to go ahead and countersink and screw the back panel into place for added strength and then clamp the sides so that the rabbet joints are nice and tight. And I see that I have a little glue squeeze out along that back corner, which I'm just going to clean out with a straw. Okay, next I'm going to show you the more traditional construction method, and this begins with making some rough reference lines because I need to cut a bunch of dados, and I need to make sure that I keep them straight so that when my two sides are up, they mirror one another when I'm done. First, I'm going to use the back nailer to set the distance to the fence on my table saw and cut a 1/4-inch groove along the back of each side piece, which is going to house the back panel. But before I move the fence to take my second pass, I also begin cutting the dados along the top and bottom because they're going to be the same distance from the edge as that groove on the back. I go ahead and do that whole thing with the other side as well. I can then tap my fence outwards to sneak up on my 1/4-inch mark for the back groove, and I just keep nibbling away until the back panel fits nicely into the groove like this. I then repeat the process with the dados on the top and bottom, continuing to tap the fence outwards after each pass. I've got to keep doing this until the dados are wide enough to fit the top and bottom panels. Now, if you happen to have a router table, this process can go a bit quicker. I still use the back nailer to set the distance to the fence and then use a special undersized plywood bit to cut the groove in the back. I then use another undersized 3/4-inch plywood bit to cut the top and bottom dados. These undersized plywood bits are made specifically to make sure that your dados are nice and tight around plywood, since plywood is never actually a 1/4 inch or 3/4 inches thick. If you want to check those router bits out for yourself, I'll go ahead and leave a link down in the description. Now, one of the biggest things that makes the traditional style of building these cabinets different than the basic style is that the top and bottom panels sit in dados that are offset by 3/4 of an inch from the top and bottom of the cabinet. Now, the benefit of doing it this way is that it creates this lip around the top of the cabinet that you can use to attach trim, and it also creates a recess on the bottom of the cabinets if you're thinking about adding lighting, say, under the cabinets and over your countertops. Next, I go ahead and slide the back panel into the groove, making sure that it's flush with the ends. And then I add 2 nailers in place and fasten them with pocket screws. Now off camera, I went ahead and built the 18-inch cabinets the exact same way, and now I want to combine the 30-inch and the 18-inch together to make one 48-inch unit. After lining up the edges and clamping them together, I go ahead and add screws above and below the top and bottom panels so that they're not going to be seen inside the cabinet. And while I'm at it, I'm going to go ahead and double check the dimensions of the carcass here now that it's all together because I'm about to make the face frame. Oh, and I also forgot I need to go ahead and fasten the back panel to the nailers using brad nails. Now for the simpler pocket screw cabinets, I don't really have a way to hide these screws from sight, so I'm just going to go ahead and go right into the inside of the cabinet. But hey, that's okay, these are shop cabinets anyway. Did I just rhyme that? Alright, with the carcasses fastened together, I can go ahead and make a face frame for each one. To start this process, I cut up some pre-surfaced hard maple lumber at the chop saw. I like using pre-surfaced lumber here because it doesn't require any milling machines like joiners and planers to get this job done. I can just cut it and begin building. After chopping out the blanks, I go ahead and head over to the table saw to rip my parts to width. And after that, I cut everything to final length using a crosscut sled by ganging my parts together. I'm going to be assembling these frames with pocket screws, so I go ahead and clamp a guide to the table of the pocket cutting machine, which is going to allow me to use that edge as a reference so that I can batch out these parts quickly. Now, besides making super clean pockets, the other advantage to this pocket cutting machine is the angle of the screw is much shallower than the typical 15 degrees of a drill pocket jig. Now, that matters because these screws are going in almost parallel to the work, which virtually eliminates the dreaded pocket hole creep that can happen whenever your workpiece moves as you drive that pocket screw into place. You can see here that I'm just using my thumb as a clamp, which I would never attempt using a 15-degree pocket hole jig. Soon enough, I have this face frame together, and I give the whole thing a sanding to 180 grit to make sure that all those joints are nice and flush. Now, since my cabinets are not going to be painted, I'm just going to go ahead and glue the face frame to the carcass and fasten it with clamps. Lots and lots of clamps. If I were painting these, I would go ahead and use brad nails here instead of clamps and just fill in the holes before painting it to avoid needing all these clamps. Okay, next come the doors, and I'm going to be using the same pre-surfaced maple to make the frame parts. Now, if you're making these cabinets for your shop, you can probably just use 3/4 inch plywood panels for the doors, but I didn't want to waste time showing you how to cut a rectangle out of plywood and fasten it to the cabinet, so instead, what I'm going to do is show you how to build frame and panel doors, which are simple to make on a table saw and are going to look much better if your cabinets are going to be used in an application like a kitchen or pantry. All these frame parts are 2 inches wide, so I'm just going to set my fence once to 2 inches and start cutting. You may decide that 2 inches isn't the right dimensions for your cabinets. I've built a lot of frame and panel doors, and I think 2 inches looks really nice for the frame. Now, I did end up cutting the longer styles using my miter saw, but to do this on the table saw, I just need to install my crosscut saw blade and break out my crosscut sled again to cut the parts to length. The crosscut sled is my preferred way to make super accurate crosscuts, and I think it's a little safer too, especially when you get to those smaller rail parts that are going to be a little more dangerous to cut at the miter saw. Now once that's done, I go ahead and put the ripping blade back in the table saw because I'm going to be cutting grooves in all my frame parts. These grooves are going to house the center panel in the finished door. Again, I'm just going to go ahead and use a single blade here to make a pass and then flip the piece end for end to make another pass, which is going to create a perfectly centered groove in my part. Next, I need to cut tongues in all the top and bottom rails. Normally, I like to use my tenon jig for this, but I decided to show you another way to do it. Now, I went ahead and installed my dado stack to make quicker work of these cuts, and laying a test workpiece down flat on the table saw, I go ahead and make some cuts until I sneak up on the fit that I want. Then I can take my real top and bottom rail parts and begin making the tongues and the ends of each. Okay, next I need to cut some 1/2 inch ply to make the center panels. Pretty simple here, I just go ahead and set my dado stack back up to make a rabbet around all 4 edges of each panel. I'm using a sacrificial fence here to bury the dado stack in so that only 1/2 inch is exposed. Now with the dado stack, unlike a single blade, this process goes by real quick and it's on to assembly. To start, I add glue to the tongues on each end of the top and bottom rails and slide them into the groove in the side, or sometimes it's called a stile. I then slide the center panel into place, making sure that it sits in the groove all the way around before adding the other stile. I give the ends a little tap to make sure that everything is nice and flush, and then I add the clamps. Just 2 clamps are needed here, 1 spanning each joint. And once I have all my drawers done, I set those aside overnight to dry. After removing the doors from the clamps, I go ahead and trim the top and bottom joints just so that everything is nice and flush and that each door is the exact same length before I go on to using my door hinge jig to create pockets for my European style hidden hinges. Now to install these, I go ahead and lay a scrap of plywood down to create the reveal that I want at the bottom of the cabinet, and I attach the hinges to the face frame, first pre-drilling and then screwing the doors into place. And after making some small adjustments to the hinges, these doors sat perfect and even. I could then use this handy door hardware jig to drill the holes for the door pulls. And that's that for the doors. The last thing I need to do here is add shelves, but before I went ahead and installed those, I wanted to add edge banding to the front edge. Now because these are shop cabinets, I'm using iron-on edge banding, which I like because of its simplicity. Just using an iron activates the glue and sticks the edge banding to the shelf. I then use a roller to ensure a nice firm bond and set that shelf aside to cool while I do the next shelf. Next I trim the edges flush and then trim the side waist using this double-edged trimmer and then just quickly sand the rough edges smooth. And these shelves just snap into place using these plastic shelf clips that fit into the shelf pin holes and hold these shelves securely in place. And that's it. 2 sets of wall cabinets done with 2 different construction methods. In this video, I'm going to answer the most common questions that I get from my viewers about making cabinets, as well as sharing my favorite tips and tricks for the process and showing you the tools that I find most helpful and least helpful. So let's get started. All right, so the first question, and this is by far the most common question I get, goes something like this. What plywood are you using? Does that plywood already have finish on it? What plywood is that? It looks shiny. And the answer is yes. I build all my cabinets out of pre-finished maple or birch plywood. Sometimes it's called UV coated plywood. And I don't know if that means that the coating protects it from UV light or if they use UV light to cure the coating. Who knows? I sourced mine at my local plywood distributor, Nashville Plywood Company.
Oh, that's real creative.
So you can make cabinets from pretty much any available sheet goods, particle board, MDF, plywood, whatever. They go up in price and quality in that order. But getting your plywood pre-finished is like the cherry on top of what is already a nice product to work with. It's more expensive, as you might imagine. It goes for $20 to $25 more per sheet. But oh my, the trade-off is no sanding and no finishing, unless you're painting it, which I'll talk more about that in a minute. Basically, once you've built your cabinet, the cabinet is done. Usually finish sanding and then finishing your cabinets is going to be a couple days more work, and that's hours and hours of labor saved when you multiply it out across a whole set of cabinets. And you may ask, well, if I'm going to be painting my cabinets, why would I pay extra for pre-finish? Well, you can still prime and paint this plywood, and one benefit to doing that is it's not going to have any grain raising and you're not going to have any grain show through on the finished piece. It's going to leave a nice glass smooth finish because the plywood already has a nice glass smooth finish already on it from the start. Also, I try to build all my drawer boxes out of 5/8 inch Baltic birch plywood for low visibility areas like built-ins, laundry rooms, and workshops. And for high visibility areas like kitchens and pantries, I build my drawer boxes out of hard maple. I also use hard maple for all my face frames because it's a very tight-grained wood that paints real well. And it's also very dense, so it's going to be durable and stand up to a lot of beating that it's going to take over time. All right, so now you know the secret of the shiny plywood. It's time to throw a quick tip your way, and this has to do with how I install drawer slides to make sure that they're all the right height and they match on both sides. No matter if you use side mount slides or under mount slides, there are a lot of jigs that you can buy that are going to help you with this installation process, but for the most part they work by using a hand or a clamp to hold a jig in place, and they rely on you marking reference lines on the side of the cabinet accurately on both sides and hitting that mark. I think there's an easier way, and you probably already have what you need to do it. Since you are building cabinets, there's a pretty good chance that you've already got an offcut or scrap laying around that's tall enough to serve this purpose. First, trim the plywood to the height of your highest set of slides. Now set that inside the cabinet like this and install one slide. Then just pop it over to the other side and install that one. Then you can just trim that spacer down to the height of the next set of slides and repeat that process until you reach the bottom. Using positive references like a plywood scrap guarantees you that the slides are going to be the exact same height no matter what. Hey, and the best part is you used a scrap of plywood that you otherwise would have just squirreled away in your offcut pile because one day you might make something from it. One thing that can make cabinet building so much easier is having the right tools on hand, and so I want to share with you a tool that I always use in this process. Well, it's not so much a tool as it is a secret weapon. This is a roll of two-sided tape, and I use this on all kinds of projects in the shop, and I don't always talk about it on camera, but trust me, it's there in the background helping me out. Do you want to stick a spacer jig to the underside of your cabinet? Two-sided tape. And a lot of times those drawer slide spacers want to fall over when I'm trying to install the slides. Yep, two-sided tape. And there are so many other circumstances around the shop where I need a temporary but secure hold on something like a second set of hands while I focus on the important task. It was so useful when I was making this bit storage tray for my router table. I could literally just stick the slides exactly in place and then install each side and guarantee that the slides would go back together after I was done. There are a lot of brands of two-sided tape, but the one that I've found to be the best is from Spec Tape. It's got a really strong hold, sometimes so strong that you've actually got to pry your work apart to break the bond. So another very popular question I get from you guys is, how the heck do you know what size to make your cabinets? And the snarky answer to that is, well, you can make them whatever size you need them to be, which if you're doing built-ins or a custom space that you need to fill with cabinets is actually true. But if you're doing something like planning out a kitchen or pantry, then you want to build your cabinets to a specific set of sizes, and the good news is there are standards for that sort of thing. There are, of course, books that are going to lay all this out, and one of my favorites is this Cabinet Maker's Reference. But a quick Google search is going to do the trick as well. Cabinet size standards. And why these standards exist is because there are whole other industries out there that count on there being a standard so that they can make things like dishwashers and ovens. This makes sure that everything goes together properly when you build out your kitchen. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but here are the standards for the most common cabinet types. For base cabinets, your two most important dimensions are height and depth, which are almost always 34.5 inches and 24 inches respectively. 21 inches is another common cabinet depth, but that's generally for bathroom vanities, not kitchens. Oh, and a quick disclaimer, all of these are American standards in inches because I'm an American and I don't know anything else. Okay, for the width, you get a little bit more freedom because there are a lot of standard sizes between 12 and 42 inches, the most common sizes being 24, 30, and 36. And you'll notice that they tend to go in increments of 3 inches. For upper cabinets, your heights have a pretty wide range, the most common being 24, 30, 36, and 42. For depth, it's a little more limited. The most common depth is 12 inches and 24 inches for those cabinets that tend to hang over the refrigerator. And the widths pretty much follow the same standards as base cabinets. And one other standard to know is that the width and height of your cabinets is measured from the outside edges of the cabinet, which if your cabinet has a face frame with overhangs on it is going to be measured from there and not from the cabinet sides. So my next tip is one that I learned over a long period of time, just saves a lot of headaches and helps your assemblies go by much smoother, and that is to measure bit heights, blade heights, and the distance from the fence using relative measurements. Here's an example of what I mean. So let's say that I wanted to cut a groove in the cabinet side to house my back panel, and I wanted to make that groove sit just in front of the nailers. Then I can just use the nailer itself to set the distance to the fence and not use a ruler or a setup block, which may lead to a less than ideal fit. Since plywoods are never really the exact same thickness from piece to piece, it pays to use the actual part that's going to go inside the finished cabinet to take this measurement. Doing it this way, you're always going to get a nice, perfect, and flush joint with no gaps. And the same goes for drawer bottoms as well. You can just sneak up on that until you get the perfect fitting joint. Next, I want to share with you one of my favorite tricks for building cabinets, and that's my method for installing drawer fronts. Anytime I'm building a cabinet with a bank of drawers, this is what I do to get them on quickly and easily. So once I have my drawer fronts made, I'm going to go ahead and pre-drill the holes where the pull hardware is going to go. This will be really important soon. Then I head to the bottom of the cabinet, and I like to make a quick jig that I stick on the bottom with two-sided tape like thus. This is going to act like a ledge. Then I can set the front in place and make sure it's nice and centered. I'm going to fasten the front to the drawer using 2 screws that go through those holes. There's no need for spring clamps or hand-eye coordination. And now I'm free to open the cabinet and fasten it from the inside with screws. Then I just remove those screws from the front and drill my holes all the way through, and then I can add my hardware. And now that front becomes the ledge that the next one is going to sit on, but you do have to account for the small gap between the drawers, and to do that I usually like to use a 1/8 inch strip of hard maple that I made special for this process, and it works perfectly. I lay one down and then add the next front, and then I use another spacer as a straight edge on the side to ensure that they're lined up vertically. Then I can just repeat that whole process over and over again until I'm done. So if that's the first time you've ever seen that process, you're probably like me and like mind blown, and now every time I install drawer fronts, I've got to use that method. In that tip, you saw me use this jig. This is the True Position cabinet hardware jig, and I use this on every single cabinet project that I do that has pulls on it. I love this jig because once you have it all set up, you can drill all the holes for your cabinet hardware really fast. It has these adjustable positive stops that allow you to position the jig in the center of the drawer front. And then with these two guides, you can set the exact width of your drawer pull. I don't think it could be any simpler. It also works on doors and with single knob pulls. There are a lot of versions of this jig online, but a lot of them are plastic. I think True Position makes the best one in my opinion because it's aluminum and it's also made in America if that's something that's important to your purchase. And the next question you guys typically have for me is related to cabinet construction, and do I always use pocket holes to assemble my cabinets? And the answer is, for the most part, yes. Pocket holes tend to get a bad rap and looked upon as a cheap DIY tool. However, they've been a common method for building cabinets in cabinet shops for decades. Personally, I think that cabinets, drawers, and face frames are exactly where pocket holes are meant to be used. And you can add glue to the joint if you want, but personally, I don't think it makes that big of a difference because of the in-grain to long grain connection not being very strong to begin with. And if you're using pre-finished plywood like I am, I don't think that glue is going to stick very well to that anyways. This entire bank of cabinets was built with just pocket holes, and I'm storing a ton of stuff in there. Aesthetically, you're not going to see any of the pocket holes in the finished cabinet, so the user of the cabinets is not even going to know that they're there. While it's true that you're not going to find a shop floor full of Craig jigs, there are a lot of production level pocket hole cutters like this one from Castle, and they even make some that are floor standing models. Another option you can use is a domino, but I really think this is overkill for common cabinets and is going to be an expensive option at that. I would go ahead and save this for use in your furniture projects. The other joint I like to add to cabinets is a dado along the back and bottom of the sides to capture the back and bottom panels. I like doing this because precisely placed dados help ensure that your cabinets are square and that the bottom is at the same height from the front to back, which comes in handy when you're using the bottom of the cabinet as a reference for installing your drawer slides. Today there are a lot of options that you can go with when it comes to cutting pocket holes, and in this video so far I've showed you my old Craig jig as well as this Castle pocket hole cutting machine, and as much as I think this thing has been a game changer when it comes to my production capabilities and efficiency, I realize that this is probably a little bit more money than the beginner is going to be willing to spend. But there are other options, like this one that I got from Banggood. Now this is a little bit more stripped down than the Craig jig is, but it is made all of aluminum, which the Craig jig is plastic. And it does come with the separate little set here that gives you the mini jig as well as an assortment of pocket screws. These are the same style screws that you would use on the Craig system as well. It's also about half the price of the Craig. Now I went ahead and tested this one out and I'm satisfied enough with it that I'm going to go ahead and build one of those box platforms like I built for my Craig jig, and that's just going to allow me to use this a little bit more effectively on future projects. Now for being half the price, I think this is pretty impressive. I really like the fit and finish of the machined aluminum over what the Craig jig feels like. I also like the fact that this comes in both metric and imperial standards when it comes to setting the depth of your cut. It also has a permanent dust collection port. Well, I guess it's not permanent, you can unscrew it, but it's a fairly low profile dust collection port. So even when you take this off and take it to your work, you can still use dust collection on it, which I think that is a really nice feature of this jig as well. And the last viewer question is all about the mystery of drawer spacing. How do you figure that out? Are there rules? How do you know how big to make your cabinets? And I know all that can seem daunting at first, and there is some math involved, but there's a methodology that you can follow to get it right. And once you do it a time or two, you can almost do it in your head after that. To get started, the first thing you need to do is decide how many drawers you want in your cabinet. For this example, let's use 4. Next, measure the inside opening of your cabinet, and this one has a 29-inch opening. A good rule of thumb for spacing your drawers is to have a 1-inch gap at the top of each drawer and a 1/2-inch gap at the very bottom. So if your cabinet's going to have 4 drawers, you're going to need 4 1-inch gaps and 1 1/2-inch gap. Now add up all those gaps and subtract it from your opening. That's going to leave us with 24.5 inches of drawer space. Okay, now it's time to make another decision. If you're going to make all your drawers equal in size, then just take that number and divide it by 4, and that means your drawer boxes are all going to be 6 1/8 inch high. Then to figure out the different heights for your drawer slides, just measure up from the bottom of the opening to the bottom of each drawer. And I always mount my drawer slides right at the very bottom of the drawer to make this calculation easy. If you want shelves in your cabinets instead of drawers, then you're probably going to want shelf pin holes to make those shelves adjustable. And to do that process, I use 2 very different tools in different situations. The first one is this shelf pin jig from Craig, and I've had this one for I don't know how many years, a really long time. I like this jig because it has metal bushings in all of the guide holes, which I think is much better than a lot of the other jigs, which are just all plastic or even wooden. And it also comes with its own drill bit with stop collar and this indexing pin. Using it is pretty simple. The base has a reference that you can butt up against your cabinet side, and you can drill your first hole and then use that indexing pin to start your next set of holes. I find that this jig is most helpful on cabinets that are already assembled because it's nice and portable and allows you to get inside the cabinet easily. But for all my new cabinet builds, I've begun using the LR32 system from Festool. This system utilizes a router with an indexing plate that moves along this rail and locks into place at set intervals of 32 millimeters, which is an industry standard dimension. This method can create runs of shelf pin holes faster than with the Craig version, and using a router bit instead of a drill makes a much cleaner hole. So for me, I'm always going to have this jig on hand because it's so handy and portable for existing cabinetry, and it's also just a good budget-friendly option for doing shelf pin holes. But for all of my new cabinets, I've already switched over to the LR32 system. For me, it's just so much faster and more efficient, and also drills really clean holes. And if you want a really great tutorial on how to use this system, I'm gonna go ahead and leave a link below to my buddy Jason Bent's video. I think it's a really thorough explanation of how to do it. He has a great teaching style, and there's really not much more I could say about this system than he already has. So make sure to go and check that out as well. All right, well, that's it. Questions answered, plus tips and tools to help you improve your cabinet making. I'm in the middle of a big pantry remodel, and I've got to build some cabinets that are good for storing large kitchen items like pots, pans, and small appliances. In this video, I'm going to show you how to build a standard 3-drawer base cabinet that's good for your kitchen or pantry. I'll show you how to build the carcass, the face frame, and the drawers. And I've even got plans available that I'll link down in the description below. All right, so there is a lot to do, so let's get going. To begin building the carcass, I need some 3/4 inch ply and some 1/4 inch ply that'll become the back and later the drawer bottoms. And the first thing I need to do is break this plywood down into manageable chunks. I love doing this using one of these centipede work holders with a piece of foam insulation on top. It's a quick and easy way to set up a horizontal work surface that allows me to cut at a comfortable height and not on the floor, which gets old really fast. To break this plywood down, I'm using my track saw. If you have a circular saw, that'll work too. You just need to make sure that you have some kind of straight edge that you can use as a guide for your saw. Once I have all my plywood blanks cut, I can take them over to the table saw to cut them to final dimensions. One of the things I make sure to do is to trim off the rough factory edges so that everything is nice and clean. And after cutting the side panels and bottom panels, I go ahead and cut out a bunch of strips that are going to end up becoming the stretchers and toe kicks. If you're wondering, I'm making 2 of these cabinets, which is why I'm cutting so many parts. Next, I need to cut dados into the sides that are going to house the back and bottom panels. To start, I'm making some reference lines on my sides so that I know where to cut my dados in the right orientation. One way to make these dados is to use a router bit. Since the bottom of the cabinet is going to sit just above the toe kick, I'm going to use the toe kick itself to set the distance from the fence. This will ensure a perfect fit with no gap at the bottom of the cabinet, and I don't have to measure anything. Each side gets one of these grooves. Then I need to do the same thing, but this time making a 1/4 inch groove along the back of each side. This groove is going to sit just in front of the stretcher, so again I'm using the stretcher to set the distance to the fence. If you don't have a router table, you can also cut these using a table saw. You can use a set of dado blades, or you can do what I'm doing here and just use a single saw blade and take multiple passes. Once you make the first cut, move the fence a tiny bit and make another pass, sneaking up on the cut until your plywood fits perfectly into the dado. The next step is to cut a notch out at the bottom corner, and this is going to be where the toe kick goes. My favorite way to do this is using my bandsaw. I set my fence to my first mark and cut until I reach the depth that I want. And to mark that depth, I'm going to use a mag switch as a positive stop. This is a great way to make sure that all your cuts are repeatable so that your parts end up the same. If you don't have a bandsaw, you can also cut these using a jigsaw and a square for a guide. I can just clamp everything down and carefully run the jigsaw across the square. If you use a fine-tooth blade, your jigsaw is going to produce a really nice clean cut on the plywood. Alright, with that, these sides are done and it's time to build the carcasses. I'm going to use pocket screws as the primary joinery, and so I need to cut pocket holes on all the stretchers. In my opinion, cabinet construction is the perfect application for pocket holes. They're plenty strong even without glue and make building the cabinets quick and easy. Alright, to get started building the carcass, I'm going to add some glue to this bottom dado. This is the only place I need to add glue because I'm not going to be using screws here. I slide the bottom panel into the dado and do the same thing on the other side before adding clamps. And the next thing I'm going to do is add the back stretchers. Once one of the stretchers is in place, I clamp the heck out of it so that it doesn't move and screw it into place. I then do the same for the lower stretcher on the back. I then flip the cabinet on its top to add 2 more stretchers. And on the back stretcher here, I'm using a scrap of 1/4-inch ply as a spacer representing the back of the cabinet. I'll show you what this looks like and why it matters in just a minute. And these get screwed into place as well. I then flip the cabinet again, which will let me install the drawer dividers. Here, I'm using 2 scraps of ply to act as spacers. I can just clamp the drawer divider to the top stretcher like this before screwing it into place. I then repeat that process using a second longer set of spacers, which is going to make the room needed for the bigger size drawers at the bottom of the cabinet. After that, yep, you guessed it, another flip. I need to install the toe kick. And yes, the pocket holes are showing on the front of this, but that's going to be okay because this is going to end up being covered with a piece of trim when I install the cabinets. And here we go again with another flip. This is where I need to slide the back panel into the slot that I made using that 1/4-inch plywood spacer earlier. This was a pretty tight fit, so I needed to get the old persuader out to tap it into place. And one last flip for good measure, and we have ourselves a cabinet carcass. Now let's make some drawers for it. For the drawers, I'm using solid maple. 5/8-inch Baltic birch ply also make really nice drawer boxes, and they take less work to make, but since all my kitchen drawers are maple, I'm going to use that to make them match. I then cut all the parts to final length at the miter saw before setting up to cut the grooves that are going to hold the drawer bottoms. I like using setup blocks to set the distance from the fence as well as the depth of cut. So this is really easy. I just go ahead and make the first cut on all my parts, and then I move the fence out 1 width of the blade and make the second pass. The drawer bottom should have a nice snug fit like this. Now I'm going to sand all my parts, which is way easier to do now than once the drawers are assembled. And then I'm going to go ahead and add 2 coats of a clear finish. The finish I like to use on maple is called High Performance from General Finishes. It's a water-based finish that doesn't yellow the maple at all. It's a super clean finish and really durable. Okay, to assemble your drawer, lay out all your parts with the grooves facing out. Your front and back parts will have the pocket holes in them and the sides will not. Arrange the parts so that the front and back sit inside the sides and clamp them together, making sure that the dados line up all the way around the drawer. Then screw everything together securely using pocket screws. When you're using pocket screws, make sure to really clamp down on the joint. Pocket hole joinery has a tendency to move on you right at the last second if you're not careful. Alright, since my back panels were so tight, I decided to chamfer the edges of my drawer bottoms to help them slide in a bit easier. You can see that the drawer bottom slides into these grooves from the back. Well, slide is a subjective term. Because the bigger drawers will potentially be holding heavier kitchen items, I'm going to go ahead and screw them in instead of using brad nails. This is going to help prevent the bottoms from bowing over time under the weight. And just like that, all the drawers are assembled. Easy peasy lemon squeezy. I also need to cut some more maple to make the face frames as well as the drawer fronts. After cutting all the drawer parts to length, I'm going to cut a 1/4-inch groove down one side of each piece. This is where the center panel is going to go. I then need to cut a tongue or tenon on the ends of the top and bottom frame pieces. These will be used to connect the frame together. To do this, I'm using a special jig called a tenoning jig. It attaches to the auxiliary fence of my table saw. Basically, it allows me to make vertical cuts safely and accurately. And this is what the tenon looks like. Isn't that awesome? And I made it all on the table saw. To begin building the drawer front, I add glue to the tongues and insert them into the grooves on the frame sides. I can then slide a center panel into place like this. Then I can add the final frame piece with more glue and tap everything into place and clamp it together. Normally for the center panel, I like to use 1/2-inch plywood and cut a rabbet around all 4 sides to fit into these grooves and give it a nice flush back, but I don't have any 1/2-inch ply right now. Instead, I'm going to go ahead and glue a second piece of 1/4-inch ply into the back recess and create that nice flush back so that I can fasten these drawer fronts to the drawers. Once the fronts are out of the clamps, I go ahead and give everything a once-over with the sander to clean up the glue joints and get them ready for finishing. To make the face frame, I'm going to assemble everything together with pocket screws and glue. I dab a little glue onto the ends and slide them into place. I then add some spacers to create the first drawer opening. I can then go ahead and add a second frame part and another set of spacers, and well, you get the idea. As you can see, I'm running out of room on my assembly table, so I'm going to go ahead and clamp everything now and screw it all together. I prep these frames for finish by sanding them as well. I'm painting these white along with the drawer fronts, but I'm going to save my painting process for another video. So let's magically fast forward, and now it's time to fasten the face frame to the carcass using glue. Since a face frame is just a decorative piece, glue is all you really need here. I would not bother with pin nails that you're going to have to go back and fill and paint over again. It's just not worth the hassle. And while that glue up dries, let's go ahead and talk about drawer slides. For these cabinets, I'm using undermount slides for their clean, hidden look and ease of adjustment. But I think a lot of people get intimidated by them, and I want to show you how easy this process actually is. The first thing you need to know is about this little pin that's at the back of each slide. This needs to slide into a hole that you drill in the back of the drawer. So the question is, how do you know where to put that hole? Well, you could spend some money and buy a little jig that will locate exactly where that hole goes, or you can do it like this. Just line up the drawer slide in the place that it would be on the side of the cabinet and jam that little pin into the drawer back. Now you know exactly where the hole goes. Keep it simple. The next part of installing undermount slides are these little clip thingies that go under the front of the drawer. They just screw into the front of the drawer like this. You may also have to cut a pair of notches out of the back of the drawer to make a place for the slides to go. But if you build your drawers the way I just showed you, then the back of the drawer doesn't go all the way down and you don't need to cut out this notch, so you can just skip this step entirely. To install these slides into the cabinet, I get myself a scrap piece of plywood that is cut to match the height of my first set of slides on the top of the cabinet. I then rest my slide on top of that and screw it into place. I repeat the same process on the opposite side. Then I take my scrap plywood and cut it down to match the height of the next set of slides. I then install those slides the same way. For the bottom slides, my spacer is just a 1/4-inch scrap of plywood. The drawers install by setting them over the 2 sliding arms and clicking them into the clips. Hear that sound? And that's it. I can slide all my drawers into place, and we really have something that's starting to look like a cabinet. Alright, the last detail we need to attend to is hardware. I need to drill the holes for the drawer pulls, and I'm using this really cool jig to do it. It has adjustable stops to help you line up the drill guide along the side and top of the drawer front to perfectly position the pull. This makes adding drawer pulls to multiple drawers fast and repeatable. Alright, check this out. To install the drawer fronts, I have a dead simple process. I made this makeshift ledge out of some scrap ply and some 2-sided tape. I go ahead and attach that to the frame using the same tape. Now I have this perfect little ledge to rest my first drawer front on so that I can focus on lining it up. Next, I put 2 screws into the holes that I made for the drawer pull and screw them directly into the drawer. This is going to hold the drawer front perfectly in place while I screw it in from the backside. Then I remove those 2 screws and drill out the holes to make room for the hardware. First drawer done. I then use a 1/8-inch strip of maple as a spacer, and I repeat that whole process for the other 2 drawers. Bam! 1 cabinet done. Whew, man, well that was a ton of work, but we did it, and now I've got a base cabinet that's ready to be installed. Hey guys, I'm Matt from MWA Woodworks, and in this video I'm going to upgrade this cluttered, disorganized pantry space and turn it into this. Much taller, deeper, and a lot more organized. Stay tuned, and I'll show you how I did it. So this project is just the beginning of what's going to be a multi-step process in updating the pantry in my house. I plan on adding more cabinets and counter space later, but my wife and I decided that we really needed to tackle food storage first. The storage we have now is just some basic wooden shelving that's not super deep. It tends to get cluttered pretty easily, and items get mixed together because there's nothing separating them. The worst part, though, is that the larger items tend to stack up on the floor in front and limit your ability to walk around and grab stuff off the shelves. So from that, we learned that we definitely wanted deeper cabinets, and the ones that I'm going to be making now are going to be 18 inches deep. We also want a better way to separate and keep track of all the different items that we store here, canned goods, snack foods, pasta, etc. To solve that, I'm going to be adding 10 pull-out drawers to the lower half of these cabinets, and the upper half is just going to be open shelving for larger items like paper towels and bulk buys. I'm also making these cabinets tall. I'm going to go ahead and use the full length of the 8-foot sheets of plywood here. I've got 9-foot ceilings in our home, so they're going to easily fit inside the pantry and better use that wall space that wasn't being used before. Now, after breaking down the plywood, I go ahead and cut the sides to final width. Basically, I'm just cutting off the factory edge here to give nice, clean, sharp edges. As I mentioned before, I'm making these 8 feet high, so I don't need to cut these sides to length. Next, I need to go ahead and cut the top, bottom, dividers, and the shelves for each of the cabinets, and I'm doing this with my track saw at the MFT. It's also really nice to use a rolling support here to help support the long plywood strips as I cut them down. And guys, that's it. All the cabinet parts are cut and ready for joinery. For joinery, I'm using dados, and to cut those, I'm using an undersized plywood bit. This is a special router bit that matches the width of plywood since a sheet of 3/4 inch plywood isn't really 3/4 of an inch. I begin by cutting rabbets in each end of the sides to hold the top and the bottom. This is pretty easy to do at the router table in my table saw because I get to use the entire width of the table saw for support. Now you can also do this job with a handheld router and a straight edge. For me personally, I always try to use the router table for any operation that I can because I find this way to be safer and I can more easily be accurate with my cut. Now the last thing I need to do is make this dado down the middle to hold the divider between the drawer section of the cabinets and the shelf section on top. I also sanded the edges of the parts that are going to go into these dados to remove some of that finish and allow them to be glued together more easily. And now it's time for assembly. I just add glue to the dados and add the center divider first. Now I'm also going to countersink and screw these together for 2 reasons. The practical reason is that the screws were going to act like clamps while the glue dries, and this means that I don't have to use clamps and wait around for those glue joints to dry on their own. I can just keep assembling. And the other reason is that because of how these cabinets are going to be installed, these sides are never going to be seen, so I don't have to worry about having ugly screw holes in the final piece. I'm also adding some right angle clamps here to keep everything nice and square while I assemble, and then move on to adding the top and the bottom. These are done in the exact same way as the center divider. Just add some glue and then screw in from the sides. And then I'm just going to set this first cabinet aside to dry while I tackle the second cabinet. And you can see here how nice and tall these are going to be. Now the second cabinet goes exactly the way the first one did. I did end up using 1 clamp because this pesky center dado was a bit tight and I had to drive it home with a little persuasion. Alright, so later on in the day, after the glue had time to dry, I went ahead and added my shelf pin holes to the top half of the cabinets. I really could have done this before assembly, but doing it now with the cabinets still open in the back is just as easy. And I really like using this little Craig shelf pin jig for this job. It has an indexing pin that allows you to make a set of holes and then line yourself up with that pin to extend that set of holes down as far as you need to go. Now to finish off assembly, I just need to add the backs. I'm using 1/2 inch plywood to make these nice and strong. And I'm just screwing these down from the back side. This is just the easiest way to do it because the edges of these plywoods are not going to be seen, and this way I'm maximizing the space inside the cabinet versus, say, insetting the back into a rabbet or a groove on the back. I really just wanted these to be quick and easy to assemble so I could get them out of the way and focus on all the drawers I need to make. But before I get to those drawers, there was one small detail that I needed to take care of, and that is adding edge banding to the front edge of my shelves. I only need to do the front edge because the other edges are never going to be seen. Now for this job, I'm going to be using iron-on edge banding, and that's really simple to apply, and I only have 4 total shelves, so this went by pretty fast. I just ironed it on, and then I used this little roller to make sure that it was firmly attached. I can then trim the ends and use this fancy double-edged trimmer to remove the excess on the sides. Okay, now with the cabinet carcasses all done, I'm moving on to the drawers. Now my favorite drawer material is always hard maple. It has a nice clean look no matter whether you're pairing it with hardwood or a painted surface, and it's super durable. I begin by chopping everything down to rough length at the miter saw. Chopping and chopping and chopping and chopping. 40 total drawer sides. Yikes! And after all my parts were cut, I flattened one side of each one at the joiner, and then I squared up one edge to that flat side. After that, I could just run everything through the planer until I reached a thickness of 5/8 of an inch for the two sides and the back, and 3/4 of an inch for the drawer fronts. I could then go back to the table saw and cut each part to final width. And I'm making the drawer sides 4 inches high and the drawer fronts 6 inches high. Finally, I cut all the parts to final length using my miter gauge. Now I want to show you two different ways to construct the type of drawers that I'm building for these cabinets. The first way is to use what's called a locking rabbet joint, and this method can be done entirely using the table saw and nothing else. I first need to cut a groove into all the sides like this. I'm using a table saw blade with flat teeth so that the bottom of the groove is flat and clean. Then in the drawer fronts, I need to make a series of cuts that will start with making a vertical cut. Then I make a horizontal cut to create a little tongue. And the whole thing fits together like this. Pretty easy and also satisfying when it all fits together nicely. Now you might ask about the top of that where the joint's sticking up above the sides, but I'm going to tell you how I'm taking care of that here in just a minute. The last thing I need to do here is to cut grooves in all the parts to accept the drawer bottoms. You can see here how the 1/4 inch plywood fits really nicely into that groove. You don't want this groove to be super tight, but you also don't want it to be really loose so that the drawer bottom rattles all over the place. Now for the back of the drawers, I'm using pocket screws, and I'm going to explain exactly why I chose this route in a minute. I promise I have a plan. Hey guys, I would just like to take a minute to say thank you for watching this video, and if you find a lot of value in it, I would certainly appreciate it if you subscribe to my channel. Also, make sure to hit that bell icon to be notified every time I release new content. Me being able to continue to make videos like this depends entirely on your support. Also, if you see me using something in this video and you'd like to check it out for yourself, always make sure to check the description below because that's where I leave links to the products that I use in my videos. Thank you once again, guys. Now let's continue on with the build. Now the second method I'm going to show you for attaching these drawer fronts is with dominoes. Now you can sub in dowels here if you don't own a domino, but I'm going to use a domino. I need to plunge into the sides to make my mortises, and I'm using this awesome domino dock that my friend Ramon Valdez makes. It cradles the domino perfectly and makes this process super easy. Now, Ramon sells these little domino docks, and I'm going to go ahead and leave a link in the description below if you want one for your shop. And for the fronts, I need to mortise into the face of the board instead of the end, so my vise helps out with this job. Now, you'll notice I'm using a second drawer front as a backer board to add more surface to balance the domino on. And I just extend my reference lines to the sides and make the cuts. The drawer bottoms are going to be made out of 1/4 inch ply, and this is pretty easy to cut up at the table saw. After ripping it down, I can just cut it up into finished dimensions. And after all that chopping, milling, joinery, and cutting at the table saw, I've got a whopping 50 drawer parts. For the drawer fronts, I wanted to do something a little different. I wanted to add a pull to the top edge. These drawers won't have false fronts, and I'm not going to be putting any hardware on them, so this is going to be a great solution. You can see here that I made this template from plywood, and I'm just going to stick it to the drawer front using 2-sided tape. I go ahead and remove most of the waste at the bandsaw, and you can also use a jigsaw for this if you don't have a bandsaw. Now I'm using the template as a guide here, but I'm staying about 1/8 of an inch away from it so I don't accidentally cut into it. Now once the bulk of the waste is removed, I use a flush trim bit at the router to run it against the template and make everything nice and clean. So the first step in assembling these drawers is going to be to glue the two sides to the front. Just glue and clamps and we're good. The locking rabbet version goes together exactly the same way, just glue and clamps. Now after sanding all the drawer assemblies, I finished them with General Finishes High Performance. This is a water-based top coat that protects the wood, but it doesn't add any color at all. If you look here, the drawers on the left are unfinished and the drawers on the right have been sprayed already. Other than a little more grain definition, the finished drawers don't look much different in terms of color than the raw wood. Oh, and if you don't have a sprayer, you can apply this finish with a foam brush just like I'm doing here. Once the drawer parts are finished, I install the drawer bottoms and then screw on the back with pocket screws. I chose to do it this way with the pocket screws because the drawer bottoms were already pre-finished and I didn't need to spray those. Once the drawers were all assembled, I could then add the drawer slides. Now I like lining up my drawer slides with the bottom of the drawers, and that allows me to install them using this method. I just set the drawer slide against the drawer bottom on a flat surface and extend the slide out so that you can see where to screw the drawers into place. Easy peasy. The last thing I need to do is make the face frame and the trim for these cabinets. Again, I'm going to use hard maple for this, and I just rip these boards into strips and plane everything down to final thickness. For the face frames, I'm using dominoes again. A lot of people use pocket screws for the face frames, and that's a great way to do it since those are never going to be seen. But assembling with dominoes couldn't be easier. Just glue and clamp everything up. The only downside here is that you have to let it dry before you can do anything else with it. Now for the only side of the cabinet that's going to be visible in this installation, I'm going to do a 4-inch rail-in style trim. Now since this is just decorative and is going to be screwed to the side of the cabinets, I'm just going to go ahead and skip the dominoes altogether and just glue it. It doesn't really need a lot of strength here, so this is not going to make a difference. Now once the trim was out of the clamps, I just broke the edges a tiny bit by using a chamfer bit and my palm router. Now I'm talking like a 64th of an inch here, not much at all, just enough to make sure that the edges aren't sharp. After that, I just screwed the trim to the side of the cabinet from the inside. Now since I'm painting these cabinets, I just went ahead and added a little wood filler over the screw holes that I can go back and sand later before I paint. This is going to make these screw holes invisible in the final piece. I also made sure the trim was perfectly flush with the sides of the cabinets by using a flush trim bit on that as well. Now one other thing I needed to do before installation was make a little base for the cabinets out of 2x4s. I milled them down to size and I assembled them with pocket screws. The cabinets are going to sit on top of this base and I'll nail the base trim to these sides. Now for the cabinets, I'm going to go ahead and spray them with a shellac base primer and then use Sherwin-Williams Chem Aqua Plus for the top coat. This finish dries fast and is really hard and durable, and it's one of my favorite finishes for painted cabinets. Okay, fast forward and I have the cabinets painted and ready to install. I set the two cabinets onto the base like so and then position everything perfectly, lining it up at the edges. I then fasten the two cabinets together with screws. Next I laid the face frame out on the kitchen floor and added glue, waiting until my wife left the house so I didn't earn myself any dirty looks. I just spread the glue and then I carefully took it into the pantry. I positioned everything and began adding pin nails and clamps. Now these thin strips of face frame were like spaghetti and had warped a little bit. So I added plenty of clamping pressure to help keep everything firmly attached while the glue dried. I then added the center pieces of the face frame with pin nails and glue. Alright, fast forward again and the face frame is all dry and in place, and now I can just move these cabinets into final position. I then securely fastened the cabinets to the wall using cabinet screws, making sure to screw into the studs in the wall. I could then begin installing all the drawers starting from the top. Now my favorite way of doing this is making a spacer out of plywood or MDF to perfectly align the slides on each side. And once I got both top drawers installed, I could take that piece of plywood back to the table saw and cut it down for the next set of drawer slides. I just worked my way down until all 10 drawers were installed. Now you'll see here that I added progressive amounts of space between the drawers as I moved down to allow for larger items to be stored there. Really, you can arrange these drawers with any size gap that you want to fit your own needs. I then just added shelf pin clips and went ahead and added the shelves to the top. And the next day I came back and added the trim to the base. Lastly, I went ahead and added some quarter round to the side where the cabinet's face frame met the wall to hide any gaps. And that's it. Last thing to do is begin filling these cabinets. Hey guys, I'm Matt from MWA Woodworks and welcome to part 1 of a 2-part series on building this kitchen island. Now in part 1 I'm going to go over how I built the 3 cabinets that make up the core of the island as well as the island top. And in video number 2 I'm going to show you how I build my doors, drawers, trim, and also how the install went. So stay tuned and let's get started. So to get started, I need to build some cabinets. And to do that, I need to set up my favorite way to cut down plywood. I use a centipede work holder that expands to 4 foot by 8 foot, and on top of that, I lay down some rigid foam insulation. And you can see my foam is pretty ratty now because it's been used for so long. The centipede does a great job of holding my plywood up off the ground, and the insulation gives my saw blade a safe place to go when I'm making a cut. If you don't have a centipede, putting the insulation on the floor works great too, but my knees and back are glad that I have one of these. So at this point, all I'm doing is using my track saw to rip down some 3/4 inch plywood into manageable chunks, and I'm also establishing some clean straight lines to reference off of later at the table saw. So in my opinion, if you're new to woodworking, a track saw is a great tool to invest in, but if you can't get one of those, using a standard circular saw and a straight edge can get this task done. I'm cutting up enough plywood to make 3 base cabinets, and this is going to form the core of the new island. You may also notice that the plywood that I'm cutting is pre-finished on one side. The pre-finished side will be the inside of my cabinets. This will save me the added time and expense of having to finish the inside of my cabinets later. Next, I use the table saw to cut all my cabinet parts to their final dimensions. This starts with making all the nailers and stretchers, and for simplicity, I make all of mine the same width of 4 inches. It's amazing how many of these things you need to make 3 cabinets. I then cut the drawer dividers, toe kicks, cabinet bottoms, as well as the side panels. When I'm done, I've got all the parts needed to make the carcasses for my cabinets. All right, now that we have all of our cabinet parts cut out, we do need to do a couple of operations to the side panels before we can move on to assembly. So first thing is we're going to cut a dado here and a dado here to accept the bottom panel and the back panel. And to make those cuts, we're going to use special undersized plywood bits at the router table. Now you can also put those bits in a handheld plunge router and use a straight edge as a guide to make those cuts. And you could even make these cuts at the table saw just using a blade that has a flat grind on it to make a nice flat bottom in that groove. Now you can also see, I'm going to point out over here, I've got laid out where my back nailer is going to go. So that's going to go this way to connect the back of the cabinet to the other side of the cabinet. And my groove here for the back panel is going to go right in front of that for a nice snug fit on the back panel, where we can go ahead and fasten that into that nailer to keep the back panel in place. Now the other thing that we're going to do is we're going to cut out this notch in the front of the cabinet for the toe kick. Now there's several ways you can do that. I'm going to use a bandsaw. You could also use a jigsaw to make that cut, or even just a handsaw to cut that out by hand. All right, with our layout measurements in place, let's go ahead and make those cuts. These are the undersized plywood router bits that I mentioned. You can get them in a set of 3, 1 bit for 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, and 3/4 inch plywood. I'll go ahead and leave a link in the description below if you're interested in picking up a set. Now to set the distance that will take the dado for the bottom panel, I'm going to use one of my toe kicks since the dado needs to rest just above the toe kick. I like doing this rather than relying on measurements. It guarantees a nice tight assembly because you're actually using the cabinet parts that are going to go into the assembly to set the distance. You can see here how these undersized plywood bits create a nice tight joint. I'm cutting the depth of my dados to be 1/2 the thickness of the plywood. Now, since my bits haven't been used that much, making these cuts in one pass felt pretty easy and smooth to me. If you get a lot of resistance or you begin to hear excessive noise or see burning, then back off the depth and make the cut in multiple passes. This is especially true when using a handheld router to make these cuts because that's a little bit more of a dangerous situation. Once I get the bottom dado cut, I set up to make the dado for the back panel. Again, using a nailer to set the distance rather than a measurement will give me a perfect fit when I assemble the cabinets. So this goes basically the same, except that I'm going to stop the cut when my bit hits the bottom dado. If you listen closely, you can hear when the bit exits the cut and is in that bottom dado. Because the cut needs to be made in reverse for the opposite side panel, I have to begin the cut by entering through the bottom dado and exiting out the top of the panel. And the last thing I need to do on the side panels is to cut the notches for the toe kicks. I like using a mag switch to set a positive stop here. This will ensure all my cuts are made to the exact same depth. This is one of my top 10 most useful shop tools. I'll leave a link in the description below for this mag switch. Okay, so the last step before the assembly is cutting pocket holes. All the stretchers, nailers, drawer dividers, and toe kicks are going to get 2 pocket holes per side. Even though I had a lot of pocket holes to cut here, it went by pretty quick and I was good to go to move on to the assembly. First, I need to add some glue to the bottom dado. Now this is the only joint that gets glue, which is nice because you don't have squeeze out everywhere you look like other types of assemblies seem to go. A couple of clamps can be temporarily used here to bring the joints together. These dados were pretty snug before I added glue, and the water in the glue tends to swell the wood, so clamps help me persuade the joint to close up. Once the joint was together, I really didn't need the clamps anymore. I'm going to hold everything together by countersinking some screws into the sides. These screws won't ever be seen in the final assembly, and anytime that is true, I prefer to use screws to act as clamps so I can free my actual clamps up for later use. Now the strength of the joint still comes from the glue here. The screws are just acting like clamps and can be removed later if you want them back. Next, I just lay my cabinet on its back to install the nailers, one on top and bottom. Now, one thing that I've noticed when assembling with pocket screws is you have to be careful of your pieces moving on you. So the best thing to do is to use a clamp and put a good amount of clamping pressure on it so that under no circumstances will that joint move on you. I then turn the cabinet on its top to install the top stretchers. Now I'm doing the exact same thing with the clamp. The only difference is that I need to add a little bit of space in the back so that I can slide the back panel into place later. So to help me with that, I'm using a 1/4-inch piece of plywood scrap to act as my spacer. And then I just drive the pocket screws into place. Once again, I flip my cabinet over onto its front, this time to install the drawer dividers. One trick I use here is to make spacers out of scraps that are the exact distance I need my divider to be from the top. I put one on each side and clamp the divider into place before driving the screws. And you can see here the pocket I created on the top of the cabinet for the back panel. After cutting some 1/4-inch ply to fit, I slide it right into place. And then use some brads to fasten the back to the nailers at the top and bottom. Now the last piece I need to add is the toe kick at the bottom. And I'm done. 1 cabinet down and 2 to go. The middle cabinet goes together like the first one. The only difference is that it's narrower at 15 inches and contains 4 drawers, so I have to add a couple more drawer dividers. Hey guys, I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you so much for watching this video. If you found it to be helpful, I would really appreciate it if you left me a thumbs up below and also leave me a comment to let me know your thoughts. I would also really appreciate your support by subscribing to the channel, and also make sure to hit the bell icon to make sure that you're notified every time I release a new video. I would also love to know what you guys would like to see from my channel. I want to make sure that I'm providing the content that you guys want to see. Okay, that's it. Back to the build. Now, one thing I should have done on the first cabinet was drill my shelf pin holes before assembly. This is a much easier process before the cabinet is together. This handy little jig makes the process pretty smooth for evenly spaced holes. The third cabinet I made is exactly like the first one, and so you can see here how all the cabinets are going to go together in one unit. To join the cabinets together, I just use screws. After lining everything up flush to the front and adding clamps to keep them in place, I just drilled the pilot holes and added the screws. Alright, now with the cabinets assembled and joined together, I could set them aside to focus on the top of the island. I purchased 2 butcher block countertops from a local home decor store where I live. I picked the ones made from acacia, which is very beautiful and is also super dense and durable, more so than hard maple or white oak, so it's going to take a lot of abuse that my family and I are going to give it over the years. However, it was quite a challenge to cut with my track saw because I was just about at the maximum depth for my saw, and the super hard acacia gave it a real workout. But slow and steady won the race, and I was able to cut these guys down to the right length. But to rip them down to width, I did decide to give the track saw a break and head over to the table saw, which had absolutely no trouble cutting these beasts. I then jointed each side to give them a clean edge to glue together. Gluing this up is like gluing a giant cutting board together. Now, luckily, I only had one glue seam to deal with, so I threw some clamps on it and waited a few hours for it to dry. Next, I needed to trim the edges flush, and so I went back to my track saw for this cut. Now, this is when I genuinely thought I might kill my saw, but man, it pulled through just fine. I took it very slow, but the whole time I was making this cut, I was thinking to myself, maybe this is time to invest in a bigger model saw. I added a chamfer to all the sides of the top to give it a nice edge, and I love using this cordless router. I waited too long to pull the trigger on getting one of these guys. They are so handy. I then sanded the top and bottom to 150 grit. I stopped there because I'm going to be finishing this with Rubio Monocoat, and you really can't go higher than that for proper adhesion. This finish is so easy to apply. You just spread it on thin with a spreader or an old credit card or even a squeegee, just whatever you have on hand. A little goes a very long way, and man, you can see the grain come to life as that oil soaks into the wood. And once you spread it, you can work it into the grain with a white abrasive pad and let it sit for a few minutes before buffing it completely dry with a cotton rag or, in my case, an old t-shirt. Just make sure to soak that rag in water before disposing of it to prevent combustion of the oil. Okay, the last thing I want to show you before I wrap up part 1 of this 2-part build is the support wall I made for the back side of the island. Since my cabinets are 26 inches deep and my island top is 48 inches deep, I really needed some extra support on the back side, so I built this wall out of 2x8s and pocket screws. This was super simple and fast to make. I just made it the same width as the combined cabinets and about 1/8 of an inch shorter than the cabinets, which is going to allow me to shim things up later during the install in case of any unevenness in the floors. I did add some 1/4 inch ply to one side just to help make everything square and to also give me a place to attach the wall to the back side of the cabinets. I just popped in a few brad nails and that's it. Now for the drawer boxes and all the trim pieces, I'm going to be going with solid wood. And for painted cabinetry, my preference is always to use hard maple. So the reason I like to choose hard maple in painted projects is because it's a very tight-grained wood, and so you don't see any of the grain structure coming through your paint job. And since hard maple is a really dense and very strong wood, it can take a good beating on things like kitchen cabinets. This kitchen island is going to get a lot of use over time, and so I want to use something that can withstand that abuse. And as far as hardwood goes, maple is surprisingly cheap, especially when you compare it to anything that you can buy at a big box store. Even if you don't have a joiner or planer yet, your local lumber mill probably has pre-surfaced lumber, which means that the planing has already been done for you. But for me, I always buy rough lumber. It's the cheapest and I have the equipment to mill it down, so that's what I'm doing here. Once everything's been milled down to size, I cut my drawer parts to final width with the table saw. I then use a crosscut sled to cut all the parts to final length. Now that I have all my drawer parts cut to size, I need to cut grooves in all the parts to accept the bottom panel. This job is done with a couple of passes at the table saw, and this is going to allow me to sneak up on the perfect fitting groove for my 1/4 inch plywood. And as you can see here, I've got a fit that isn't too tight, but the plywood does stay in place when you hold it like this. Now because these are kitchen cabinets and people are going to be in and out of these drawers all the time, I like to put a small round over on top of all the drawer parts, which is going to protect people from getting little scrapes and cuts on their hands. This is especially true with hard maple because these edges are notoriously sharp. Now at this point, I just need to sand all these parts smooth before it's off to the finishing room. And because I'm going to be spraying a clear coat on these drawer parts using my HVLP system, I didn't film it. I really don't have a good way to protect my camera equipment yet while I'm doing this kind of work. But so you know, I am putting an interior water-based polyurethane on these drawer parts. Now I use water-based polyurethane here because the oil-based ones tend to yellow maple, and I really want to keep that nice, bright, natural look to it. Alright, so when it comes to building these drawer boxes, I decided to use pocket screws. Now up until this point, I've always assembled cabinet drawers by using locking rabbet joints. But I really wanted to try this method to see if it made any difference over time. I don't really anticipate there being a problem, but if there is, hey, I'm a woodworker and I can just make new drawers. And the bottom just slides in from the back side of the drawer and is nailed into place with brads. All right, with the drawer boxes made, I could move on to the face frame. So laying out the face frame parts was pretty easy because I made these plywood spacers which were the exact size of the drawer openings. That way I could make sure everything was properly aligned and properly spaced. Now, if you remember from part 1 of this series, I combined 3 kitchen cabinets into one single island unit. This is because I wanted one seamless face frame to go over all of them. I'm using nothing but glue here on this frame, so I just began figuring out the puzzle of clamps needed to hold this whole thing together. Now, because I'm spraying finish on this, I went ahead and painted the face frame now before I added it to the cabinets. And the face frame is just glued onto the cabinet, so I spread some glue and then lay the face frame on it and begin positioning it right where I want it. And then I begin adding clamps and more clamps. And you'll see that I'm adding a little bit of padding between the clamp and the face frame so that I don't mar the freshly painted surface. The last thing you want is to have a clamp impression embedded in the finish. And as you can see, I had to get creative with using lots of different types of clamps to make sure that I had enough to get this thing fully seated on the cabinet. All right, with the face frame and the clamps, I went back to the drawers to install the slides. Since I'm using undermount drawer slides, I need to install these little clips under the drawers. These undermount drawer slides are really so nice to install. I don't know why I always thought that these would be harder to install than regular side mount slides, but they're actually easier because they have so much adjustability. They do have these little tabs on the back that you need to drill small holes for, but locating these holes is actually pretty simple. Just set the drawer slide on the drawer where it's going to be positioned and tap down with the mallet. Some people make special jigs for this job, but I find this method to be just as easy. Now once you drill the holes, you can test your fit with the drawer slide. See? Easy. And once you have that bit done, you just set your drawers onto the rails and press until you hear the click. The drawer is locked in and ready to go. Alright guys, so when I need to install multiple drawers in a cabinet, I like to use a scrap piece of plywood as a spacer in order to get my drawer slides placed right where I need them. Now what I do is I start with the longest piece of plywood I need in order to get me the right height to put in my first set of drawer slides at the top. Then I just go to the table saw and I cut my plywood down to the next set of drawer slides that I need, get those installed, keep cutting the plywood, keep installing the drawers until I get to the bottom, and I'm done. Pretty nifty trick, and all you need is a scrap piece of plywood. So like I said, I like to install the top slides first. I then measure to see where my next set of slides needs to sit just above the face frame. I then cut my spacers down at the table saw and install the next set of slides. I repeated that same process for the third drawer. And always save the bottom drawer for last, and to install these slides, I just use a few washers to get the proper spacing. And now the fun part. I check to make sure everything goes together perfectly. Now this is always the most nerve-wracking part to me until I can see all the drawers are in and I can breathe a sigh of relief. Alright, with those in, now I can work on the drawer fronts and doors. So for this cabinet, I'm just doing simple frame and panel doors and drawer fronts. And I begin by cutting all the frame parts to length at the table saw. The next step is to make grooves and everything for the center panels to go. I like using my dado stack for this job because I can make the grooves in one pass. But you can do the same trick in multiple passes with a regular ripping blade or any blade that has a flat grind tooth. Next, I use my tenoning jig to cut out the tenons on the end of my horizontal frame parts. These tenons are going to fit into the grooves I just made. Now if you like this tenoning jig and this auxiliary fence setup, I have a whole video that I made explaining how I built it as well as plans so you can build one yourself. I'll leave links down in the description for more information on that. The center panels of my drawers and doors are made of 1/2-inch ply, and I need to make a rabbet around all sides to go into the grooves in the frame. I just bury my dado stack into a sacrificial fence to make these cuts by running all 4 sides against the fence to make the rabbets. After that, glue up was easy and I got all my drawer fronts and doors in the clamps. These all go together the same way. The tongues from the horizontal frame parts go into the grooves on the vertical frame parts, with the center panel taking up the rest of the room in the grooves. And once the last door is clamped up, I can set them all aside to dry. The last detail to tackle before everything got painted was to make the side and back panels. These are just going to be made from 1/4-inch plywood and 1/2-inch material for the border detail. Now I'm just gluing these frames together since this is just trim and there's no need for more structural fasteners. I did the same thing for the back panel using scrap ply as spacers to make sure that I got my stiles evenly placed. Once the frames come out of the clamps, I spread some glue on them and sanded the plywood where the frame's going to sit because I'm using pre-finished plywood here. I just added some heavy things to act like clamps. This was really my only option here because I was already using most of my smaller clamps on the face frame. Now to install the drawer fronts, I cut up some 1/8-inch spacers that I used out of some of the scrap maple that I had left over. And I also made this little one-time jig that's going to help me set the first drawer and door spacing on the bottom of the cabinets. I put some double-sided tape on it, and this is going to stick under the face frame and allow me a ledge to place the first drawer front on. This will make sure that I have a nice, consistent, and even gap with the bottom of the face frame. Before I do that, though, I need to prep the drawer fronts for hardware. After locating where the holes needed to be, I drilled them and checked it against the handle. I always love it when I don't screw this part up. Yes! Alright, so the method I like to use to install drawer fronts is that once I have the drawer front in place, I go ahead and put 2 screws in from the holes that I made for the drawer pull. Now this is going to keep the drawer front in place while I add screws from the back side that are going to hold this on. And when I'm done, I can just remove the screws in the front and then drill those holes all the way through to add the drawer pull. Just like that, the first drawer is done, and I can just add a spacer to the top and begin the process all over again. This time I'll also use a spacer as a guide vertically to make sure that my fronts are all lined up. Now it's just rinse and repeat all the way up the cabinet. I also use my little jig to set the door height to match the bottom of the drawers and screw them into place. From there, I can just add the last 2 drawer fronts. And that's that. Everything is done and ready to install. To begin the install, I get some help from my neighbor. He likes to lift heavy things and put them down, and for that, I am forever grateful. Now, once the cabinets were in place, I quickly checked everything for level, and somehow, I don't know how I got this lucky, but this part of my kitchen floor was completely level. No shims were needed. Now that the cabinets were exactly where I wanted them, I added cleats by using some double-sided tape to place the cleats under the cabinets. The tape is strong and it's going to keep these from moving as I move the cabinets back out of the way. That gave me room to secure the cleats to the floor with 3-inch screws. And then I just moved the cabinets back over the cleats and fastened the cabinets to the cleats from the sides. Next, I added my support wall to the back of the cabinets. Now I made the height of the support wall 1/8 of an inch shorter than the height of the cabinets just in case things got wonky with shims and I needed some wiggle room. As it turns out, I didn't need to do that since the cabinets were already perfectly level as they were, so I just added the shims to the wall by tapping them in until they were flush with the top of the cabinet. I then could fasten the wall to the cabinets from the back, and then fasten the wall to the floor. Next, I trimmed the shims, and for that, I used my oscillating multi-tool. And the last detail was to add some elongated holes where I was going to fasten the top of the island. This is going to allow for seasonal expansion and contraction of the hardwood top. For the side panels, I fastened them from the inside of the cabinet. All the panels are going to be held on by screws. This way, if I ever wanted to repaint the island or even change the style of the trim, all I have to do is pull these off and make new ones. I'm using plywood spacers here to line everything up to make sure that I have enough room for the base molding later. Alright, so you'll see here that I'm fastening the sides to the back with countersunk screws, which I'm going to deal with in a minute. Next, it was time to add the top with the assistance of my lovely wife. And once we got the top set in place, I could use a ruler to make sure that I had a proper reveal all the way around the cabinets. Now to get the island top attached to the cabinets, I needed to drill a hole in the drawer dividers and then use an extra long drill bit holder to drive the screws in. And one final check for level. I still can't believe that I didn't have to shim those cabinets. And then I just reinstalled the drawers and added the doors. The final detail was to add the base trim, which I just fastened with brad nails. And then I added buttons to those screw holes on the sides. I went back and painted these when I did final touch-ups on the island. The only thing left to do was to fill these drawers and utilize all this great new storage space. And that's it. One kitchen island done. I really hope you guys enjoyed this 2-part series, and I hope that it helped answer some questions that you might have about building your own kitchen island. Hey guys, in this video, I'm going to take you step by step through how I built this media console with storage. Keep watching, and I'll show you how I did it. I built this console to be a media cabinet, but it could easily work as a sideboard or liquor cabinet. The white base is contrasted with this beautiful walnut top that I finished with Rubio Monocoat. And the cabinets feature custom-made molding as well as some fancy hardware. So this project utilizes plywood and a bit of walnut for the top, but the primary material is hard maple. I begin by breaking down the lumber into rough blanks at the miter saw. I picked up about 30 board feet from my local hardwood dealer, which should more than cover my needs. From this material, I'll be able to get my parts for the doors, 2 side panels, and the face frame. And I'll have a little bit left over for the trim molding later on in the project. Once I have all my blanks cut, I head off to do some milling. The lumber I bought was S2S, which means it's surfaced on 2 sides already. Surfaced it may be, but flat it ain't. So I need to mill these pieces flat on one face at the joiner. Then I run that flat face along the fence to square up one edge. Next I take 3 steps to the left and run all my parts through the planer to get the opposite face flat and parallel to the face that I just jointed. Once I flatten that face, I continue to run the parts through the planer until I reach my target thickness of 3/4 of an inch. Now each of my parts has 2 flat faces and 1 squared edge. By the way, now that all the parts are milled, this is a great time to label everything so I know exactly what needs to be cut out of each piece. The next step is to trim all my rough blanks to final length. I'm using my miter gauge to cross-cut these parts at the table saw. Doing this helps ensure that if I need to cut 2 identical parts from the same blank, I'm guaranteed that those 2 parts will be the same length. Finally, it's time to cut all my parts out of the blanks. I use that square edge I made way back at the joiner to reference against the fence. First, I batch out all the rails and stiles for each of the 4 doors and 2 side panels. Then the parts for the face frame and the raised panels. This went fairly quick as I didn't have to adjust the fence width many times. But man, these parts started piling up quick. And after untangling this mess of parts, it's time to focus on the joinery. I installed my dado stack in the table saw to cut nice 1/4-inch flat bottom grooves. I'm cutting offset grooves here, so I measure my distance to the fence and get to cutting. For these doors and side panels, I'm using traditional tongue and groove construction. I like this method for 2 reasons. First, it doesn't require any fasteners. No dominoes, no pocket screws, no nothing. Just one piece of wood glued to another piece of wood the way nature intended. And second, the entire method of joinery can be done just using a table saw. No fasteners required, and 1 tool needed to get the job done? Sign me up. Okay, once I have all the grooves cut, I need to cut the tongues, and I'm using my tenon jig for this job. By the way, if you want to make this fence and jig setup for your own saw, I have a video explaining exactly how I did it and a set of plans to go with it. I'll leave links for both of those in the description below. Finally, I need to glue up my door panels, which are going to be made from 2 boards each because I couldn't find material wide enough to make them with a single board. But it's simple enough, and I gang 2 panels together in the same set of clamps to make things more efficient. Once the panels are out of the clamps, I just need to trim them to final length using my crosscut sled. Oh, and I have a video and plans for the sled too. Again, links in the description. Next comes the brutally boring part, sanding. I need to get these panels sanded to 120 grit, removing the glue lines and any runaway glue that might cause a high spot for the next step. What's up on Instagram? Epoxy river table, epoxy river TP dispenser, bourbon moth trying to fit in something. Next, I rip each panel to final width, and these guys are all ready to get raised. I'm using a panel raising bit on my router, or as I like to call it, the spinning circle of death. Remember when using a bit this large to set your router to its lowest speed. I begin this process by taking a shallow pass first to remove a good bit of the waste material. Remember, 3.5-inch bit spinning at 10,000 RPMs. Take it slow. Next, I move the fence back, exposing the rest of the bit, and cut the panel again. You're still taking a pretty big cut here. This video is sped up, but I'm really moving at about 1 inch per second across the bit. So this first set of passes is probably going to leave some burn marks. So what I like to do is raise the bit just a hair and take one last cleanup pass. And here you can see how this produces a nice clean result. And I'm going to go ahead and sand these edges now before I glue up because it's easier to do at this stage. Now it's time to glue up the doors and side panels. So this really is pretty easy, just put some glue on the tongues and slide them into the grooves.
Is there a mature way of describing that? Now just add the panel. It should fit easily with not much force needed. Finally, add the other style to complete the frame and panel door and clamp it up. Slight adjustments may need to be made, so use a rubber mallet or a dead blow for this to reduce the chance of denting up the material. Here's another look at the process, this time for the side panels. It's basically the same process, but you have little legs sticking out on one side. Really, in my experience, if you cut your parts square, you should end up with a square panel pretty easily. Just a couple taps here and there, but that's just about it. Once those are out of the clamps, I sand the frame and also the middle of the panel. And that's it. 4 perfect little doors and 2 side panels are all ready to become a cabinet. Okay, I now need to cut my case parts out of this 3/4 inch plywood. All the plywood parts come out of the single sheet, which is pretty nice. The track saw makes quick work of this. I then cut my dividers and shelves to width, and that's it. 6 plywood parts in total. The center divider gets glued together, so I spread an even layer of glue with a roller and go and find all the small clamps I own to get a good seamless glue up. Okay, one detail that I think is easy to address now are the shelf pin holes. I use some double-sided tape and a strip of plywood to make sure I place the shelf pins in line with one another on both sides, and then the shelf pin jig is pretty handy at helping me get evenly spaced holes. You can do this step once the case is built, but I find it easier and quicker to do it before everything is assembled. Next, I begin working on the joinery for the cabinet. Now I'm using dominoes here to fasten the case together, however dowels or pocket screws can be substituted here without changing anything. This will be reflected in the plans for this build as well, so no matter what joinery you use, the plans will still work for you. Getting the domino mortises in the middle of the case is a little tricky, but my go-to method is to use double-sided tape to lay down a strip to reference off of. Now I'm only using like 16 dominoes here, so the joinery is cut in no time and it's time to begin assembly. Each mortise gets some glue and a domino is tapped into place. I then add a little more glue to the domino and tap the side panel on. Whenever I do cabinet construction with dominoes, I make the mortises a little long to allow for lateral adjustments to be made. I then repeat the same procedure for the other side where you can get a little bit better look at what I did. I then pull out my longest pipe clamps, which are just barely long enough for this job, and make sure everything is square. Now it was about right here in the project that I realized that these were the only 2 clamps that I had that were long enough to do this glue up. So I had to wait about an hour to let this dry before I continued. I then added the center dividers, which slipped on nice and easy. Now comes the fun bit. In order to get the bottom of the cabinet on, I had to line up the dominoes in 2 different directions. Now my method for doing this is to get one side secured first and then work on getting the dominoes on the other side partially inserted by bending the plywood slightly. This allows me to go back and pop the center divider in place and then finish off the side, and basic case construction is complete. I just move my 2 clamps from the top of the cabinet to the bottom while leaving the clamping squares in place to make sure everything stays square. I also pre-drilled and installed screws to act as clamps for the center divider. Now once the glue is dried, you could remove these screws, but they're never going to be seen where they are, so I'm just going to leave them there. A quick double check for square, and onward I go. Okay, one final detail on the case is adding a center support to the bottom. This console is 6 feet long, and so this is going to prevent any kind of sagging in the middle over time. Now while this glue up finishes drying, I'm going to focus on the face frame. I start by cutting the hinge mortises in the sides of the frame. I'm going to go ahead and use dominoes again for the face frame construction, so I plunge my mortises at my pencil marks and proceed to assembly. The face frame goes together in a matter of minutes, and 3 clamps hold it all together. Now I'm installing the face frame with glue, and for this job I like to use a thick, quick setting wood glue. I just slap the face frame on and get to clamping. And clamping, and clamping, and clamping. Since I'm painting the console white, I thought it would be a great idea to contrast this with a walnut top. So choice. To do that, I first need to lay out how I want to glue the boards together. Now while I pay attention to grain direction, I focus on aesthetics more than anything. The top is going to be fastened to the console with screws, so warping really isn't an issue here, and I'd rather have the most beautiful looking top I can get from this wood. At the table saw, I rip clean lines as well as cut out any unwanted defects like big knots, cracks, or wane. I then order my boards in sequence so I know how they go together. Next I grab each set of boards and run them across the joiner together. This ensures a nice tight joint line when gluing up. First I grab 1 and 2, then I grab 2 and 3, 3 and 4, and so on until I've jointed each pair, being careful to place them back in the same orientation on the workbench. Now with a little glue and a little mindfulness, I glue them up. I'm not using dominoes or biscuits for this alignment. The top isn't that big, so I'm just going to be super careful that each joint is seamless and aligned to one another as I clamp. I glued the top up in 2 halves so I could run each half through the planer before finally gluing the 2 halves together. Again, being super careful of getting an aligned glue joint because now I can't go back to the planer. The only way to fix this would be to sand it or use a hand plane. I also like to wash the glue line with water this time so I can get a good look at the glue joint and also to make sure that I don't have a ton of sanding or scraping to do at the end. For the molding on this console, I decided to make my own simple profiles using the basic bits I had. The big box stores really just didn't have anything I liked for this project, and they pretty much sell pine or MDF molding, which I didn't want. All the molding was glued up and clamped in place with mitered corners. Now I was going to attach the molding to the top the same as the base molding, but the miters were being finicky, so I broke down and used my pin nailer to help keep everything in place. And just for good measure, I clamped the miters to make sure that they stayed tight. Once the top was out of the clamps, I used my track saw to trim the ends to length. I then gave everything a thorough sanding, starting with 80 grit and stopping at 150 grit because I'm using Rubio Monocoat to finish the top and I can't sand beyond that grit. Another small detail I needed to tackle was edge banding the plywood shelves. This is iron-on banding, so after applying a little heat to activate the glue, I used this little roller to make sure everything was tight. Next, I trimmed the ends with a flush trimmer. You could also pair the ends with a chisel if you don't have one of these tools. After the glue is good and dry, I use this sweet edge band cutter to remove the waste on both sides with a single pass. And finally, I use this edge breaker, which is a great way to sand down the corners to prevent the edge banding from chipping down the road. I went ahead and put edge banding on both ends of this ply so that if one end got damaged from use over time, I could flip the shelf around and have a fresh edge. Okay, here's that process again. Iron on, roll out, trim the ends and the sides, and break the edges. Very simple, very fast. I'll leave a link in the description below for each of these tools in case you want them for your next edge banding project. The walnut top is going to be fastened to the console with screws. Near the front edge of the cabinet, I drilled 4 holes with a 1/8 inch drill bit. And near the back side of the cabinet, I used a 3/8 inch drill bit, which I wiggled back and forth to make an elongated hole. This will allow the top to expand and contract as needed. Okay, one other detail that I wanted to add to the top was to chamfer the underside. I really think this is going to look cool because it's going to continue the angular transition between the molding and the top of the cabinet. I just put a 45-degree chamfering bit in my router table and it did a great job on this task. After finding the depth that looked best to me, I continued on to the other 3 sides. Next, I prepped for finish by masking off the inside of the cabinet. I'm going to be spraying this cabinet and don't want the overspray to get on the inside. Finally, I tacked the back on the cabinet with my brad nailer and it's off to spray some finish. Now, unfortunately, I didn't film the finishing process because I really didn't want to harm my camera equipment. Once everything was finished, I cut the hinge mortises in the doors. Now, the depth and size of these depend on the exact hinges used, so I like to save this step till the end as I'm installing the doors for a better fit. I then slide the top onto the cabinet, making small adjustments until I'm happy with the placement. Each screw will get a washer before I fasten the top down. All that's left now is to reinstall the shelves and add the doors. Oh, I added magnetic catches by gluing a small block of plywood to the inside of the face frame and then added small rare earth magnets to the doors for extra hold. And I think this console turned out super clean. I'm so stoked to be adding this to our living room.
Hey guys, welcome back. In this video, I'm going to be showing you how I added some storage to my new shop by building this tall shop cabinet, which I'm going to use to store all of my safety gear in. Stay tuned and I'll show you how I did it.
Now that my shop renovation is complete, I need to turn my attention to storage solutions. I have a lot of fresh new wall space and not much occupying it. The first thing I made was a simple cabinet to hold my audio and video gear, and the next thing I thought about was my safety gear and how it would be really nice to have all of that in one central place. and I needed to hold my eyewear, hearing protection, dust masks, and my work gloves and aprons. So I think a tall freestanding cabinet is in order here, more like a locker than a standard cabinet. To begin, I need to break down all of my cabinet parts from this pre-finished 3/4 inch maple ply. This stuff is fantastic for cabinets because, well, no sanding and finishing needed. My favorite way to break down plywood is to put it on this expandable work support with a piece of foam insulation providing a nice cutting surface. It allows me to cut with my track saw at a very comfortable height. So the first thing I did was cut a section off the end of the plywood panel that I don't need for this project, so I'm just going to save that for later. I marked out and cut a strip for each side of the cabinet, as well as a third strip that I'm going to use for the top, bottom, and the shelf. I then took my strips to the table saw and cut them to final width while at the same time removing the factory edge off of the plywood. I then used my new crosscut sled to cut the top and bottom of the cabinet as well as the shelf. So if you'd like to see how I made this crosscut sled, I'll go ahead and leave a link in the description below to the video and the link to the step-by-step instructions as well as downloadable plans. Also, I need to make one final cut on the shelf piece, which needs to be a 1/2 inch less deep to account for the back panel of the cabinet. So next I need to make the rabbets and dados in the cabinet sides, and to do that I used these undersized plywood bits, which are meant to make perfect fitting dados for plywood, which is always slightly less than a nominal thickness. I went ahead and ran a test cut in a small piece of the scrap for my plywood, and as you can see, it fits nice and snug. And now that I've verified the fit, I begin by cutting my rabbets in the top of each of my cabinet sides. These will hold the top of the cabinet. I then moved my fence back and made dado cuts in each side, and that's going to house the shelf. And I repeated that again to make the dados for the bottom of the cabinet. I then swapped out bits from the undersized 3/4 inch bit to the undersized 1/2 inch bit in order to cut a rabbet down the back of each cabinet side, which is going to hold the back panel in place. There's something so nice about running your workpiece across a router bit one time and getting the right size cut without having to make a second pass for adjustments. And if you guys are interested in picking up this router bit set, I'll go ahead and leave a link in the description below. Now that I had all my parts cut and my joinery cut, I threw everything up on the bench and fit it all together. And since some of my joints were pretty snug, I went ahead and used a clamp to make sure everything went together nice and tight. I decided not to hassle with glue, but just screw everything together since this was a shop cabinet. It just saves me some time waiting for glue to dry. Now, if this cabinet was going inside my home, I would have sanded the ends of the top, bottom, and shelf so that they could be glued into the dados rather than screwed. I then began checking for square to make sure everything was, well, square. I then pre-drilled and countersunk holes in the sides of the cabinet and used black drywall screws to fasten the cabinet together. I really love the look of these screws against the maple plywood, and drywall screws have an aggressive thread that holds plywood together really well. Alright, then I set the back panel into place, and once again I pre-drilled and countersunk all my holes and then used more drywall screws to fasten it to the cabinet. And after that, I slid the top of the cabinet into place and fastened that to the cabinet as well. One final detail was to add the spacer underneath the bottom at the front of the cabinet, and I just screwed that in from the sides. Okay, now the carcass of the cabinet is complete, and you can start to see why I love this pre-finished plywood. It already looks so good. So next I turned my attention to the face frame, and I made it out of hard maple, which I flattened on the joiner, squared up an edge, and then ran it through the planer until I got it to 3/4 of an inch thick. Then I ripped it to rough width at the table saw and took it back to the planer to plane them down to final width. This left each strip clean and perfectly dimensioned. And at the miter saw, I cut each of the short frame parts to length, making sure they were identical. After a final check for length, I had all my frame parts ready to assemble. Now the way I like to make face frames is to lay the parts out exactly where I want them on the cabinet. And then I mark with a line where each joint will line up, and I also use letters to know which joints line up together. Now to assemble this, I busted out the old pocket hole jig. I think it's the perfect tool for making face frames because it's quick and easy. I then got all my frame parts aligned in clamps to drive all the pocket screws into place. This is where those marks I made on the frame are clutch. Once the screws were in, I could pop off the clamps and my face frame was ready to go. Now to attach the face frame, I just used wood glue. More specifically, I used Tight Bond Quick and Thick. It's great for this application because it stays in place when you brush it out and it doesn't cause a lot of drips like standard wood glue. It also dries quite a bit faster than standard wood glue, which means I don't have to have my cabinet in the clamps for very long. I just placed my face frame where I wanted it and began clamping it down. This is one task that does require a lot of clamps. Lots and lots and lots of clamps. Now while the glue dried on the cabinet, I began working on the door. Now for this cabinet, I'm making a frame and panel door that uses figured maple for the frame and pre-finished plywood for the panels. Now if you haven't seen my video on making frame and panel doors, I go into all the details of how to make one of these. I'll leave a link in the description below if you want to learn more. Now after cutting my frame parts to length and width, I ran a 1/2 inch deep groove down the center of each part. The grooves will hold the panel in place, and the width of the groove needs to match the thickness of your panel, which in my case is just under 1/4 inch. I then used my tenon jig to cut the tongues in each of the horizontal frame parts. These tongues will fit the grooves I made in each of the side pieces of the frame. I just made the tongues 1/2 inch deep and just wide enough to fit in the grooves. And you can see here what one of these finished tongues looks like. I then put glue on the tongues and lined them up in the grooves in a similar way I did with the marks on the face frame, so everything lined up where I wanted it. Now, getting the panels in place without wrecking the alignment of the frame was by far the hardest part. But after I slid that top panel in place, I could see the light. I just added that last side and then checked everything for square before adding the clamps. I really love this look of the hard maple frame with the pre-finished maple plywood in the middle. It is so awesome. Now once the door was dried and out of the clamps, I eased the edges of each side with a block plane. Now this just adds a nicer feel to the door when it's opened and closed. And after sanding to 120 grit and then 180 grit, I applied an oil wax finish to the frame. This is a dead simple finish that I enjoy applying and then buffing with a rag until you get that buttery smooth feel and a bit of a luster. It's not super durable, so I don't recommend it for cabinets in a laundry room or a kitchen, but for shop furniture, this is just fine. I then began laying out for the hardware. In this case, I used Euro-style cup hinges. Again, I explained this process in my door making video, but I will say that you should follow the instructions that come with the hinges that you install because they will all have their own placement and depth requirements to install correctly. Now once I got the hinges installed on the door, I lined everything up and installed the cabinet side of the hinge on small blocks that I attached to the inside of the face frame. Now it was about this time that I realized I had made a mistake. I bought hinges that were for frameless cabinets, and I had put a face frame on this one, so I was using totally the wrong type of hinge, and you can see how badly the door lined up with the cabinet. So, after a quick trip back to the store to get the right hinges, I got the door installed and adjusted correctly. I think this cabinet turned out great. It looks beautiful, and I love pre-finished plywood. Now that the cabinet construction was completed, I needed to install some hangers inside the top part and the bottom part of the cabinet. The first thing I did was added hooks for various style hearing protection. And then I added hooks to the bottom of the cabinet to hold my aprons. And the last thing I needed to do was install some magnetic catches so that this big door stayed closed. Then I could load all my gear into its new home. Everything has a place and everything in its place.
Hey guys, welcome to MWA Woodworks. I'm Matt, and in this video, I'm going to show you how I build a shaker style door for a cabinet in my shop. And so I chose a shaker style door because of its simple, clean look, and also because of its relative ease of construction. It's just 4 frame parts. You cut a groove through the middle of each one, and you put a panel in the center to create a door. Super simple. So I'm going to show you how I did that and also how I used Euro-style cup hinges to attach the door to the cabinet. So stay tuned and I'll show you how I did it.
My first task is to mark out where the frame parts are going to be cut out of this maple stock. For my door, I need 2-inch wide parts for the frame, 2 longer sides, and 2 shorter top and bottom pieces. Since I'm using a rough stock, I'm going to chop my stock with a miter saw first. I'll get a piece for my long parts and a piece for my short parts. Then I'll take my parts over to the joiner to get one side flat and one edge square. After that, I run them through the planer to get the other face flat and coplanar. And I continue to run them through until I get to my final thickness of 3/4 of an inch. Next, I'm going to set my table saw to rip my parts to final width. I'm making my frame 2 inches wide, which is a good size for most frame and panel doors. I rip my 2 long parts first, and then I rip my 2 shorter parts. Now I have my 4 frame parts milled flat, square, and to width. The next thing I need to do is measure and mark my pieces so that I can cut them to final length. And the miter saw makes quick work of this task. The next step is to cut the grooves in all my parts to accept the panel. My grooves will be a 1/2 inch deep and just narrower than 1/4 of an inch, which is going to make a snug fit for the panel. So to perfectly center the groove, I'm going to run it across the blade and then flip it around and run it across the blade again. There you go, a perfectly centered flat bottom groove. Oh yeah, I guess I should mention that using a ripping blade or any type of flat tooth grind blade is the best for this. That's going to give you that flat bottom in the groove. And so the final bit of work to be done on these frame parts is to cut the tongues on each end of the 2 short pieces. And these tongues will be cut to a 1/2 inch to fit into the grooves on the long parts. Cutting these tongues requires the use of a tenoning jig. And if you're not familiar with it, a tenoning jig rides on your table saw fence and allows you to run pieces vertically across the blade with accuracy and plenty of support. Now, I've made several tenoning jigs in the past, and the one I have now fits onto my auxiliary fence. But you don't have to make one like this. You can make one that rides right on your existing fence. So all you need to do here is set your blade to the correct height, which in my case again is 1/2 inch, and then set the fence distance to cut the tongue in the center of the workpiece. I pass the workpiece over the blade and then flip it over to the other side and pass it across the blade again. Then I readjust the fence distance to cut the remaining waste on the outside of the first cuts that I made to create the tongue. And depending on the width of the stock, there may be a 3rd pass needed to clean up any remaining waste. As you can see here, the tongue should fit perfectly in the groove on the long side of the frame like this. So it's a good idea at this point to do a dry fit to make sure that your frame measures the correct width before you glue up. You really don't want any surprises when you go to install the door and find out that it's too wide or too narrow for the opening. And the last thing I did before glue up here is cut the panel for the inside of the frame. Again, I'm using a 1/4 inch pre-finished maple plywood for my panel. So I cut the panel to fit inside the grooves within the frames with about a 1/16 of an inch of room all the way around the inside of the groove. So another thing I like to do is ease the edges of the panels to make it fit better inside the grooves of the frame. This really makes glue up go a lot more smoothly. Okay, once again, I'm going to do a dry fit of the whole door, just again to make sure that there are no surprises before I start putting glue on these parts. And I apologize for the poor camera angle here, but I promise you everything fit together nicely. So now I just add glue to one of the tongues and insert it into the corresponding groove on the long side. I then grab my panel and insert it into the grooves on the bottom side of the frame and the side of the frame. Now you can check for square here now if you want, or you can wait until all 4 sides are glued up. It's pretty much your choice. Now just repeat that process on the other side, making sure the top and bottom pieces sit flush with the long side. And I use a mallet here just to tap everything into place. Finally, add glue to the tongue on the opposite sides and slip the final frame piece into place. You only need a couple clamps for this glue up. Just clamp until you see squeeze out along the glue joints. There's really no need to crank down on the clamps because you're going to risk distorting the door frame if you do that. Okay, one last check for square, and it's time to wait for the glue to dry. Once the door comes out of the clamps, I can give it a sanding with 120 grit to get everything level and smooth at the glue joints. I then follow that up with 180 grit to make it smooth to the touch. Now to finish my door, I am using an oil wax blend. I really love the silky smooth feel and easy maintenance of this finish. You may opt for something more durable like a lacquer or a poly finish if your doors are going into a kitchen or another highly trafficked area. But for my shop, I'll just stick to the simple and fastest finish because I can repair it easily anytime I want. Since the back of the panel isn't pre-finished, I go ahead and hit that with the wax too. This is just going to make it more look like the outside of the door.
Now I went ahead and did the same thing to the front side, applying the finish to the frame, just making sure to stay away from the pre-finished panel in the middle. It's not really going to hurt it. It'll wipe up. I just didn't want to make too big of a mess. And you can really see the figure pop out in that maple when the oil hits it. So nice. So I allowed the finish to dry for about an hour or so before I buffed it out with a clean rag until I got a nice luster and a buttery smooth feel. All right, now we're in the home stretch. The final step is just to add the mounting hardware. In my case, I'm going to use Euro style cup hinges. So first I mark out the location of the cups. Then I cut the recesses with a Forstner bit that is 35 millimeters in diameter, which is pretty standard for cup hinges. Now since I did this by hand, I stopped to check the depth just to make sure that I was sneaking up on the 1/2 inch deep recess that I needed to make for these hinges. The cup hinges are a bit of a process to install, but not really difficult. Just follow the directions that come with your hinges for proper placement and depth of the recesses required for the hinges. I then mark out the corresponding locations on the cabinet side and get ready to pre-drill my holes. Now once I get one hinge screw in, I can then mark out and pre-drill the locations of the other holes. This really helps line everything up for me. I screwed everything into place and then checked to see if there are any adjustments needed to make sure that the door was in the right place. So as you can see, my door didn't quite want to stay closed, but these cup hinges come with 2 or 3 adjustments to make, and I got mine all dialed in for a perfect fitting door. As you can see, a frame and panel door is a step up in quality and appearance and is well worth the effort to make given the simple joinery needed to make it. And if you start off with lumber that is already surfaced and squared for you, like at a big box store, you can actually make these doors entirely on a table saw.
In this video, I'm going to give you all the tips for hanging cabinets onto concrete walls. Come on, the tips are over here.
Okay, to get started, here are the tools you're going to want to have on hand. You're going to need a drill with a 1/4 inch drill bit, a hammer drill with a 3/16 inch masonry bit, and a driver with a 5/16 inch hex head attachment. You're also going to need concrete or masonry screws. The ones I have here are Tapcon screws from the big box store. Make sure to add a washer to each one of these screws for extra gripping power. Also make sure to grab a level too, we're going to need that. But before any of that matters, I need to get my cabinet up onto this platform. Because I already have base cabinets installed below, I built this spacer platform so my wall cabinets would be 18 inches above. Now, if you don't have that situation, you can always screw a 2x4 to the wall and use that as a ledge or a helping hand to set the back of your cabinet on as you attach it to the wall. To make sure I was perfectly centered, I centered the platform to the base cabinet and then centered the wall cabinet to the platform. I recommend removing the doors and the shelves, which is just going to make the cabinet lighter, and it's also going to protect the doors from getting damaged. Next I'm going to jump up here and check everything for level. Everything should already be level, but it's definitely good to double check. Now with the 1/4 inch drill bit, I'm going to go ahead and drill pilot holes into the back of the cabinet. You should use an old or at least a cheap drill bit here because you're going to be running the tip into the concrete behind the cabinet, which might cause it to dull over time if you do it enough. Now I'm showing you this way because this is going to leave a little mark on the concrete wall, which is your way of knowing where that screw needs to go just in case you need to set the cabinet down before you install it or it shifts in any way while you're trying to install it. I'm making 6 pilot holes for this 48-inch cabinet. Next, I use the masonry bit and the hammer drill to extend the pilot hole into the concrete. I just use the pilot holes I drilled in the back of the cabinet as the guide. Now, you can do this with a standard drill and a masonry bit, but you're going to hate your life if you do that. A hammer drill is so much more efficient. I mean, it was made for this purpose, and it drills this hole into concrete in seconds rather than minutes. I then grab my driver and my Tapcon screws, and I begin fastening the cabinet to the wall. Now, word of caution here, it's super easy to overdrive these screws and strip out the hole. Just take it slow and stop driving once you feel the cabinet suck up flush to the wall. Now, if you do happen to strip out the hole, you do have a couple of options, one of which is to locate a larger diameter Tapcon screw, and the other one is to just go ahead and start over and drill a new hole. Now, having all 6 installed, I go ahead and relocate my platform to where my second cabinet will live and repeat the process. Now, another tip here, if you're adding these cabinets to concrete that is below ground, say in a basement, you're going to need to be mindful of the chance of water seeping through the wall. If that's your situation, I would recommend either sealing the wall with Drylock paint or adding a plastic sheet to the back side of the cabinet before installing it. This way the water can't come in contact with the back of the cabinet, causing mold issues or causing the wood to rot over time. And after install, I go ahead and vacuum up that nasty concrete dust. You don't want to leave that behind because it's bad to breathe in. Then I can go ahead and reinstall my shelves. And reattach the doors. Oh, and one more tip before you go. Always take doors on and off of cabinets by using the door side of the hinge. That way, when you reinstall them, they go back into the exact position that they were before. And that's it. My cabinets are securely fastened and ready to be loaded up.
Well guys, I hope you liked that video, and if you did, go ahead and leave me a thumbs up below and also leave a comment below if you have any questions about the video. Hit that logo icon and subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon to be notified of future videos. Speaking of videos, I've got a couple other ones floating around up here that I think you guys would really enjoy, so make sure to check those out, and until next time, have fun in the shop.